My name is Mark Canuel. I'm director of the Institute for the Humanities. I'd also like to introduce my colleague and collaborator, Professor Kellee Warren. She is an archivist in the Special Collections at the UIC Library, and we are both co-hosting this event. This conference is a collaboration between the Institute for the Humanities and the UIC Library Special Collections. And the absence of an in-person component to the conference, which would have included some of the UIC Library's treasures that document the rich and complex political history of the city, will certainly be felt. But I think that's more than compensated for by the diverse and interesting scholars that are going to be speaking to us today. The conference idea began with conversations that I was having with my collaborator from the UIC Special Collections, Kellee Warren, who you'll be hearing from in a few minutes. The conference simply wouldn't have happened without Kellee's intellectual generosity and adventurous spirit. In addition, these conversations engaged us in wider dialogues with our colleagues, and I just want to thank some of those people: Jenny Breyer, Lisa Freeman, Lynn Hudson, and Jane Rhodes, who advised us both on the form and on the content of the conversations that we're going to be having. I do feel, and I know that lots of people, perhaps everyone, feels that the best work at the Institute comes from the ground up and comes from consulting with faculty and students about the issues that are most urgent for them. And this conference definitely evolved in precisely that way. Our former Dean of Libraries, Mary Case, she is Dean Emeritus, was a fervent supporter of this particular conference and really everything that involves connecting the humanities to research at the library. And Karen Kellee, our interim Dean of Libraries, has also been very supportive in that regard. And I'd also like to thank Dean Tantillo of the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences for supporting the Institute during really difficult times, and that support really counts a lot for all of us. Our Associate Director at the Institute, Linda Vavra, has been an essential presence for helping us to migrate programs online, and her fearless ingenuity has made it possible to keep these vital conversations together with even new collaborations and possibilities for intellectual synergies to emerge, even when social distancing is keeping us so physically, often painfully apart. Our graduate assistants, Tierney Powell and Dan Majors, have been essential to every part of advertising and launching the program as well. Dan Majors was handling our last-minute frenetic changes to the website. I do want to thank Tierney also for constructing the beautiful poster, which captures many of the energies of the program because of its photograph of the Gerber Hart archives overlaid with graphics that capture the innovative spirit and energy of the panelists who are going to be speaking over the next couple of days. Our partners in digital and media services, Paige Wynn, she's been so helpful in putting this together, and Tina Dillon is doing our captioning, so thank all of you so much. Finally, thanks to every single person who is presenting and to everyone in the audience. This is a time when our energies are flagging and dispersed, and we really appreciate everyone's ability to come together and talk about issues that are an important dimension in our lives, but not the only one. And so the fact that people are here and sharing both as audience members and participants, well, we don't take any of that for granted. The intellectual community is something that we really cherish. I want to come back to more granular specifics of how this conference emerged And I promise not to take too much time because I am not the specialist in this virtual room, although I do have great passion and enthusiasm for the subject. I'm not the most qualified, in fact, perhaps the least so. Still, Kellee and I thought that some background would be useful, and Kellee asked me to talk about my own experience with archives, and so I can do a tiny bit of that. I had worked with Kellee on making materials in our special collections at UIC available to students in a class I was speaking on British Romantic literature. She was showing me how many materials the library has pertaining not only to the British Romantic age, but more particularly to the transatlantic slave trade and the abolition movement, and this was part of what my class was about. And although I knew that we had these collections at UIC, I hadn't spent a great deal of time with them since most of my research has taken me to other places, the British Library, the library at University College London, the Huntington Library, and other locations. But the UIC Library's Special Collections is certainly not on anyone's map of collections that are crucial for work in 18th and 19th century studies, but part of the point of displaying items was to highlight that the library actually holds an impressive trove of items in its transatlantic slavery collection, which consists of over 300 years of legal, religious, and secular publications documenting the Atlantic slave trade, including works from Spain, France, Portugal, England, Africa, and the Americas. The collection happens to contain also one of the most important letters ever written by Olaudah Equiano, a slave who was eventually freed, but this was a letter to the abolitionist Granville Sharp. And it was really amazing to be able to show that letter to my students and also to conference attendees when I co-hosted a conference, a national conference in my field. So the existence of the letter by Equiano is well known, and it's been carefully documented by Vince Carretta and other scholars of Equiano. So the mere fact that it exists isn't the thing that's worth highlighting, or at least people know that it's there. But it does highlight the important labor, research, and expertise that archivists like Kellee do to expose and help shape our understanding of collections by working with our students and colleagues, both here at UIC and beyond. Those of us who do work in early periods know that as scholars, our work in the archive, on analogy with the case that I just mentioned, is punctuated by a logic of the open secret, the object hidden in plain sight like Poe's purloined letter. Discovery can sometimes be a kind of recovery, an unearthing that not only exposes the object, but the history of the reasons for the silences surrounding it. My first personal experience of this kind was in relation to women's writing of the Romantic age. The work of Maria Edgeworth, when I was in graduate school, was only just being written on by a few scholars, and I just happened to be working on the work of Jeremy Bentham at the Manuscript Archive at University College London. There, I found correspondence never discussed and never published between Edgeworth and Bentham's translator, Etienne Dumont. And the letter hadn't been translated by anyone, and I translated a little bit of it in my first book. And so a whole region of scholarship could be opened up between one of the most important philosophers in our history and this very rising to importance Anglo-Irish novelist. To name one more interesting example from my own period, just last summer, my colleague Omar Miranda at San Francisco State discovered that the entire plot of Byron's most famous poem, Don Juan, was based upon news stories about Francisco Miranda, a Venezuelan Venezuelan exile. And so this is connecting the poem to a whole history of South America that no one had quite grasped before. People didn't know that Byron was actually basing this poem on someone else's life. So again, a kind of open secret, an object hidden in plain sight. If this sounds like the scholar as a kind of chivalric hero or wily detective, well, this idea is totally wrong and extremely, or at least vulnerable to critique. In fact, one of the lines of discussion that Kellee and I had together centers around the need to question many of the conventional distinctions generated within academic departments themselves between scholars and archivists. According to one of those conventions, the archivist produces a silent or even invisible labor for the scholar's questing or detection in order to produce scholarly capital. The archivist in university and other scholarly library settings is the one who brings the manuscript or rare book to the scholar who reads it and weaves a history from it, or a theory from it. Perhaps needless to say, this is a conference inspired by the imperative to depolice the boundaries between scholar and archivist, which our own scholar archivists at the UIC library and other libraries across the country and across the world are doing all the time. Our conversations are inspired by the reciprocation that happens when scholarship seeks to unbind itself from its canonical archives and acknowledge the scholar archivist as a partner in their efforts. Kellee is going to be speaking more about her own work as an archivist, but I want to say a bit more by way of tracing out what seems to us like a useful background. And again, this is my own version of it. That came from our conversations and not necessarily Kellee's. So I apologize to Kellee if I'm just mangling every single discussion we ever had. During those discussions anyway, I talked to Kellee a lot more about her work, and our talk drifted toward recent acquisitions and special collections. We also began talking about the political ramifications of the work she was doing, how it intersects with and questions systems of value and evaluation, why the work she is doing is necessarily political, and what obstacles are faced by her and other archivists in the process of shaping, reshaping, and questioning collections. We remarked upon how this way of thinking about archives runs parallel to the work that has been happening across disciplines of history, literature, languages, and cultural studies. And this led us both to start thinking about how we might engage in a discussion that would involve researchers across disciplines in the humanities in discussions with scholar archivists, since the conversations cross over each other with increasing intensity as humanities disciplines and interdisciplinary studies reshape themselves in response to the call to question their normative foundations and boundaries. We recognized, furthermore, how important the context is for our discussions and the connection or distinction between community and academic archives is a topic that we hope to open to fruitful discussion. Many here are familiar with both and can give us valuable insights about that. But Kellee and I also discussed, only just a couple of days ago, what it means to be having a discussion of this kind at a diverse public research university that is also chronically underfunded. We reflected on how vast the distinctions are between UIC's special collections and a collection like Harvard's, where Shakespeare's first folio is featured on the introductory page of those archives. The connection between archive and canonicity, the archive and a sustained vision of what counts as a cultural history, was animating part of our discussion there. The ambition that UIC has, And again, others will have so much more to say about this than I do. The ambition of UIC is not merely conditioned by not having the money to buy a first folio, but also by not having a representation of the Western canon as its aim. I've already come clean to say that I'm a historian of British literature, so I'm the last one here to dump on Shakespeare. That's not the point of anything I'm saying. But it is worth mentioning that, as many of you know, Mills College just to keep itself financially afloat, just sold a first folio just over a week ago for around $10 million. And so the connection, this idea of Shakespeare being a kind of weirdly evanescent and disposable hero for keeping a college, basically a whole college afloat, is worth an entire discussion on its own. And when we look at what really matters in the archive for a place like UIC, we must ask the questions: an archive of what, for whom, and for what purpose? The discussion is part of a conversation about humanities that some have identified as a perennial problem of the humanities' removal from the urgent concerns that move us, our students, and our mutual bonds with communities. The question of how archives are to be included in any discussion of engaged humanities is necessarily a dimension of the conversation that we've been having here. And I think that the question of engagement and engaged scholarship adds significant depth to the subject of our inquiry over the next couple of days. That's because to approach archives less as a vanishing point of origin and more as a changing part of who we are and how we think orients the work of the archive as a work of engaged scholarship. And you might say that this is kind of connected to the way that someone like Foucault talks about the archive as a system of enunciability. But at the same time, the kind of work that we're talking about could be called slow engagement. And I take that term from Moya Bailey, who spoke here last week, who defines a new form of slow digital humanities that privileges analysis, reflection, and critique in our use of digital technology and tools. Slowness, in Moya Bailey's argument, is a plea to gauge resonance and effectiveness, but also, and maybe more importantly, to interrogate the truly damaging effects of technology that get suppressed in our desire to view the digital as a harm-free way to reach a public. The archive might be an instance of slow engagement, marking our past and present precisely in order to furnish moments for analysis, reflection, and critical realignment in our present and our future. This isn't in any way to downplay the urgency of this conference's subject matter. And frankly, we weren't even thinking about the bizarrely auspicious timing of this event just before the election, although obviously our planning took place in a moment of prolonged, multi-layered political and environmental catastrophe. Tracing out the period of protest and empowered opposition to that catastrophe might actually, possibly, track along with the intensification of a specific form of archivism or archivalism. A simple engram viewer shows a 7-fold increase in the use of the very word archive since 1980, with a steep incline in the new millennium. And of course, the whole idea of the Google archive, is itself a kind of bizarre and contested thing. But still, to reflect on this incline since the dawn of Reaganism and the collapse of the public sector, we thought about how our conversations are framed by changes over time, from the notion of the archive as an effect of political power versus a notion of the archivist's neutrality versus the challenging of that neutrality in the 1950s and 60s with social movements that sought to contest and reshape archives from the ground up. These social movements coincide with and inform many of the postmodern approaches to the archive that took place in the 1960s and 70s. The very use of the archive as a singular in such works, the archive, and I know that I've been doing it myself, is telling, as if the archive is an ontological rather than a plural and political fact. It was important for us to acknowledge the cross-pollination between postmodern theory and the practices of the archive. Kellee and I talked about how Foucault and Derrida were not simply the purview of cloistered theory courses in literature departments. Instead, their work has had an influence on archival practice, or at least has been enmeshed with some of it. So we realized and talked about the continued relevance of an argument that Jacques Derrida has made now over a quarter century ago in a way that has entirely new reverberations. In Archive Fever, Derrida follows out a memorable and influential analysis of Sigmund Freud's ambivalent approach to his archiving of common knowledge on paper and in print. That is, his archiving of what is supposedly common to all in our mutual immersion in the complexities of psychic experience. Why save? Why commit to print something that is so common? Something is preserved, but only precariously spirited from the destructive impulses of the death drive. And Derrida extends that analysis, concluding that the archive is not merely about preserved memory, a recording of spontaneous, alive, and internal experience. On the contrary, Derrida says, the archive takes place at the original and structural breakdown of the said memory. There is no archive, he continues, without a place of consignation, without a technique of repetition, and without a certain exteriority. No archive without outside. No archive without outside. Derrida's account here, one that points to the necessary exteriority of the archive, that is, its framing, sheds light on the practice of archiving as necessarily and irreducibly political. Most of us who have been doing work in our different fields have become more aware than ever, partly because of our heightened attention to the exclusionary and unequal structuring of institutions where we live and work, of the way that objects and methods of study are mediated by selection processes that transform practices of discovery, assembly, and curation into more codified institutional collections. The connection that archives have with questions of power, voice, agency, and institutionality may very likely come up in the conversations that we have together, just as they do in our own encounter with materials and practices in our work as scholars and archivists. In a tour about a year ago that I took of the extraordinary Gerber Hart archive, and John D'Amelio is here with us to talk about that tomorrow. In my tour of that archive about a year ago, I was struck by the sheer range of objects in that collection that have come to serve as one of the nation's richest troves of queer life in this city and beyond. I was struck by how it was not just a row of manuscript boxes and bound volumes, although there's certainly plenty of that too. It was a beautiful and vibrant record of people's lives that triggered dozens of my own memories and memories of other people's memories. At least in my own takeaway from that encounter, it brought to mind Eve Sedgwick's account of the reparative work of queer stories, narratives, and memories, a work of reparative justice. I just have a tiny bit more to say here, and I don't mean to cite Derrida and Sedgwick as any key to understanding, in fact, far from it, but rather to invite questioning of the ways in which the work that scholar archivists engage and help us rethink approaches to the questions that cluster around the politics of the archive. In fact, thinking about the reparative invites thinking into the approaches to the archive that both skeptically question and performatively enliven it. In a sense, we're brought to question the limit that Derrida's focus on the archive, the limit of Derrida's focus on the archive's necessary exteriority presents. Whose exteriority is he talking about? Who determines it? And why? Saidiya Hartman, a longtime friend of the Institute, emphasizes the violence of the archive in her imaginative recovery of the narratives of slaves, and she points us toward an effort of recovery that makes the archive into a site of reparation and compensation. Compensation for silence about the rich details of experience in the subjugated Black body. While very much an account of what it takes to form a reparative impulse toward the past, the urgency of her project, she says we need accounts for the unaccounted for, animate the urgency in so much recent writing that blends imaginative work with historical research, and that thereby emphasizes the urgency of the aesthetic and philosophical labor in the humanities more than ever before. Hartman's work also connects subtly to the way that so many scholars in our current moment are engaged in an archiving of the ephemeral present and the lessons of slavery and its continued legacy in the layered violence against Black people and other people of color. And this is to be found in a painful recognition of the fragility, the evanescence, and non-presentness of the present. The mechanisms of digital technology, which we hope to be able to discuss here, have been crucial in this regard, providing a technology of fleeting witnessing, not merely of spectacular violence, but also of the quieter corners of the violent structure of our reality. And I think here of the numerous videos that capture how a supposedly tranquil park can turn into a scene of Gothic and racist horror. The theoretical gloss that all of this supplies for the necessary exteriority that Derrida ascribes to the archive is not to notice it as an ontological fact then, but as a political reality. The present political moment demonstrates this more than ever, I think, when it's now clear that the worst part of political regimes aren't that they can constantly tell lies, but they can actively suppress the means through which any truth, anyone's truth, can be told. They can promote erasure. The Supreme Court's decision on Wisconsin on Tuesday is only the latest in which the silencing is the law of the land. And I think this only attests to the importance of the counter narratives that we can tell here. So without further ado, I'd like to go on, since we are now at that time, I'd like to go on to introduce our first keynote of the conference. And before going on with this keynote, I'd like to remind the audience and presenters that they can post questions in the chat. And after Professor Warren speaks, I will pick up on those questions and I will help to pose them to her, and we'll handle the Q&A that way. And please feel free to post questions at any time and I will pick up on them. So I'm pleased to introduce Kellee Warren as our first keynote to the conference. Professor Warren is Assistant Professor and Special Collections Librarian at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Her research is focused on critical information literacy and culturally sustaining pedagogy, specifically the inclusion of other forms of knowledge in library instruction and materials. She is also interested in online learning, social media, and connecting underrepresented groups with their cultural heritage through archival source materials and oral histories. She received her BA in English from UIC in 2013. She received her Master of Science in Library and Information Science from the U of I at Urbana-Champaign in 2015. And before coming to us at UIC, she worked at a range of vital institutions throughout the Chicago area, including the Chicago Community Trust, the Black Metropolis Research Consortium, and I should add that Marcia Walker McWilliams, the executive director of BMRC, is generously joining us for the roundtable discussion tomorrow. Since joining us, or rather rejoining us at UIC, Kellee has focused her efforts on crucial aspects of the library's collection. As I mentioned earlier, I've seen her up close for her invaluable work in outreach and education. She promotes new acquisitions, she aids in publicizing special collections, assists in research in the collections, and promotes the use of collections in course and curricular design, among many, many other things. She has published articles on a range of subjects related to issues of equity and diversity in education, the archival profession, and archives themselves. She has spoken widely on these issues with recent talks on diversifying book history and critical race pedagogy in the classroom. It's important for me to add here that faculty and staff throughout the university have commented on the invaluable work that Professor Warren does at the library to make its collection not merely open to, but speak to and more organically connect to the diverse population of our students. Please join me in a very warm virtual welcome to Professor Kellee Warren to speak with us today on Collecting Against the Grain, Collaboration to Sustain a Public Institutional Archives. Thank you, Kellee.
Thank you, Mark. That was a wonderful introduction. Welcome, everyone. I am so excited to have these conversations over the next 2 days. Many of the attendees probably, you know, the title of my talk is probably familiar to many of the attendees. So I kind of grabbed it from historian and Professor Ann Stoller, her idea of reading the archives against the grain. So I did a little cursory search and noticed that maybe 1 or 2 archivists have mentioned the idea of collecting against the grain in our practice. So that is the influence of the title of my talk. So let me go ahead and share my screen. One second, sorry. Okay, so we've already done the introductions. The title of my talk today is Collecting Against the Grain to Sustain a Public Institutional Archives. For those who I have never met, my name is pronounced Kellee. Last name is Warren, and I am Assistant Professor and Special Collections Librarian at the University of Illinois at Chicago. So today we're going to do an introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit about different archives and different histories, how this conference sort of came into being. We're going to look at some of the professional demographics of libraries and higher education and kind of narrowing that down to special collections, archives, and rare books. I'm going to look at the sort of gateway function of everything else archival called appraisal. I'm going to introduce the idea of a conservative archive, and then talk a little bit about the postmodern archive, and then at the conclusion, the idea of collaborative collecting. So I had a difficult time trying to figure out, because it is something that, you know, I've seen at a lot of conferences. I kind of had to go back and forth in my mind about offering a land acknowledgement. I think that we need to come up with another way to sort of respect Indigenous people. However, that being said, I know that there are some people in attendance who are not aware of the tribes who were on this land. So we will move forward with the land acknowledgement. So the tribes connected to the Chicagoland area. This land area includes what is currently known as Wisconsin. So a pretty substantial land area are the Potawatomi, Miami or Peoria, Winnebago, and Menominee. It is not lost on me that I work for a university that is in a system with a land grant institution as its flagship. Therefore, it is very important to offer this land acknowledgement. There are still some conflicting and invisible narratives of the different Native tribes that lived in this area, but from what I have gleaned from a little research is that this should be close to accurate. Also, as a marginalized person and archival science researcher, I know that the invisibility and conflict come from disrupted narratives. So a brief moment of reflection, and then we'll begin. And something about the social justice approach to archival science is making sure that community organizations are supported. So here I've included the website, the URL to the website for the American Indian Center of Chicago. Please feel free to write down that information so that you can donate. Okay, so I'm opening this discussion with the story of how this conference came to be. Last July, Mark requested that I create a display case for a different conference on romanticism, as he mentioned. I included some materials from our Sierra Leone archive and anti-slavery collection. In any case, Mark and I ended up in a conversation about an article that was making waves in the archival and special collections community, which I will briefly introduce in this presentation. From our conversation, the seed for this conference was planted. Let me just say that it was very difficult to organize what I wanted to talk about for today. There's simply so much going on, so my presentation will reflect some of that mayhem. I ultimately decided to discuss what archivist and scholar Terry Cook called the gateway function to all other archival functions, appraisal. I'm going to briefly take a look at the racial demographics of librarianship and archives to give some context to my talk. And also, I know that some attendees are not really aware of the racial demographics of librarianship and higher education, and also narrowing it down to the concentration of special collections, rare books, and archives. There is some overlap in the roles of special collections librarians and archivists, but for the sake of time, I will not go into the details of it all. But just to say that there may be some misunderstandings about the differences, and I consider myself a hybrid librarian archivist. That is, I've trained in the functions of an archivist, but my main and current position is as special collections librarian who manages public services, which include reference, instruction, and outreach. And I'm also the curator of rare books. So the following slides represent the racial demographics in librarianship, archives, and special collections librarianship. As I mentioned, there is some overlap between all of these roles. This first chart represents the racial demographics of librarianship and higher education as of 2012. I pulled this data from an initiative that the American Library Association published called Diversity Counts, the Diversity Counts Initiative. As you can see, In higher education, librarians are at 92% white. Others are at 2%, which is pretty stunning. And then African Americans are at about 6%. I would say it fluctuates between 5 and 6%. The second graph includes data from a slightly different survey, the American Community Survey, but is still part of the Diversity Counts initiative. I'm highlighting the overall number and the number of Black professionals with this slide. But if you take a look at the other categories, you'll notice that the numbers are significantly bad across Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in the profession. The Black professional percentage, as I mentioned, usually fluctuates by a half point to a full percentage point. But the percentage has been pretty static for the past 15 to 20 or more years. This third chart from Diversity Counts represents professionals in libraries and archives. And we can see that Black, Indigenous, and other people of color are still significantly underrepresented in this specialty of the profession. And this last slide, published in a 2016 article, these final figures are from a 2015 survey administered by the Rare Books and Manuscripts section of the Association of College and Research Libraries, a division of the American Library Association. Some attendees may be aware of this, but for those who are not, these demographics may be revelatory or revealing. What do these numbers tell us? They tell us that demographics inform how selection decisions in archives are made. I am at a certain point, I will try to sort of decenter the white hegemonic thinking around how we collect in archives. But I have to begin by briefly looking at the conservative foundation of archival science. I mentioned the Frank Bowles article in my introduction. He is a veteran archivist and scholar, and his most current article, To Everything There Is a Season, caused quite a stir before the Society of American Archivists 2019 annual conference. So it's worth giving some space to Mr. Bowles. I'm just gonna leave this up a little while so that you all can take a read through. But for those who cannot, I will read Conservatism in the Archives. The goal of this article is to argue for the legitimacy. Sorry, trying to move this box. Okay. The goal of this article is to argue for the legitimacy of a counterintuitive idea that local autonomy and unique archival missions define the purpose of the profession better than assumptions of universal documentation or social justice rooted in a notion of archival power. Archival diversity is the most feasible way to demonstrate power, serve justice, and document society as completely as possible. So what Mr. Bowles is arguing sounds like common sense. It sounds perfectly reasonable, right? But I argue that Mr. Bowles is being disingenuous with his point. Granted, throughout the article, Mr. Bowles goes into some valid points about space and financial constraints of special collections libraries and archival institutions broadly. But for the most part, this article reads like an opinion editorial piece. And at certain points, it veers off into the offensive. I won't go further with it, but to say that his argument sounds like a states' rights argument, and that we're all just fine with how things are. And what he suggests is the natural approach, that we are exercising power if we implement a social justice approach in our collecting. In any case, embedded in his argument is a denial of the fact that cultural heritage institutions are a system with a history of collecting Eurocentric materials. Bowles argues against what archival scholar F. Gerald Ham calls universal documentation, which is to ensure that we can make the historical record as whole as possible. There still exists a certain partisan view of the archivist as an objective, neutral clerk, but we know that archivists can have a history of documenting power. Archivists have been and continue to be attached to power. So in light of circumstances that we find ourselves in, all of us, interrogating the archive in political and cultural terms seems appropriate. In his chapter, Men, Masculinities, and the Archive, Francois Dansereau points out the political nature of archival activities when he states that archival activities and principles, including their characteristics of respect de fons, description, original order, and current definitions of provenance and creatorship, are part of the political processes that impose a structural order on records. Dansereau continues that these activities are not going to necessarily work with approaches to the collections where oppressed or suppressed subjects are centered. I am connecting Mr. Bowles' thought to one of the fathers of conservatism, Edward Burke, because archival functions in traditional settings continue to be steeped in dominant conservative practices. By this means, our liberty becomes a noble freedom. It carries an imposing and majestic aspect. It has a pedigree and illustrating ancestors. It has its bearings and its ensigns are memorial. It has its gallery of portraits, its monumental inscriptions, its records, evidences, and titles. Without going in depth on conservative thought, Edmund Burke sheds light on the fundamental raison d'etre of the archives. What is that reason to be? In their 2010 article, Pedagogy of Fear, Toward a Fanonian Theory of Safety in Race Dialogue, Leonardo and Porter state that the colonizer creates a narrative which posits that he is the creator of history, thus justifying conquest as well as racial and cultural supremacy. In times like these, white men have evidence of their greatness, their dominance. Burke's words refer to the archive and the grand narrative that is generated from it. Welcome, everyone. This is an image of the reading room in which I spend much of my time. I host students for instruction in the reading room as well as researchers. Information studies scholar Jesse Erickson, among other things in his chapter, reflects on the history of reading rooms through an analysis of physical space, race, and gender. In his chapter, The Gentleman's Ghost, Patriarchal Eurocentric Legacies in Special Collections Design, he says it plain, that special collections reading rooms inherited by research libraries across the Western world were designed for white men. He further points out that special collections, rare books, and archival professionals often attempt to fool themselves in the objective language that is used to define archival functions. In our documentation and our equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives. That is, among other moves toward innocence, we use language to attempt to distance ourselves from the Eurocentric history of the profession. Erickson explains that linguistic abstractions that circulate within the field's professional discourse can support existing power relations, many of which are symptomatically hierarchical. In other words, the language of neutrality, equal opportunity, and access often hide the persistent and systemic issues around space, race, gender, sexuality, ability, class, and so on. If we don't believe these things to be true, all we have to do is look at the rhetorical moves in Trump's executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping, where the administration weaponizes Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to stop government entities and federal contractors from having more inclusive work environments and hiring practices. It is an executive order to punish naming whiteness. So reevaluating, interrogating, and improving archival functions is a way to unsettle the entrenched exclusion of the underdocumented from our cultural heritage record. For those in attendance who may not be familiar, these are the 4 archival functions. Appraisal and acquisitions, processing, which includes arrangement and description, programming, reference, instruction, exhibits, lectures, conferences, such as this one, and then of course, preservation, conservation, and digitization. Out of these 4 functions, as I mentioned earlier, I will explore the gateway function to all other functions in archival work. Appraisal, or what is simply selection for permanence. Archivists tend to make appraisal out to be something nebulous and complicated, but simply it is the process of assigning evidential or informational value to documents, records, or artifacts, and then selecting and acquiring accordingly. The functions that follow are arrangement and description. That said, because of racial, class, gender, sexual, etc. demographics of the profession, this process is still often articulated with the white gaze. Decisions about what should be kept and preserved are based upon Eurocentric notions of value. Different knowledges exist within the archive, silenced or otherwise. Collection development policies and documentation are supposed to add a level of transparency to these functions. However, because of human intervention, there are always conversations to which outsiders are not privy. So let's look at how the Society of American Archivists defines appraisal. So there are 3 different definitions here. And then, of course, I wasn't going to include everything on a slide because that gets kind of cluttered. There are several notes. So using the writings of a combination of archival scholars, SAA defines appraisal as 1, the process of identifying materials offered to an archives that have sufficient value to be accessioned. 2, the process of determining the length of time records should be retained based on legal requirements and on their current and potential usefulness. So number 2 would be, if you think about it, and if you're at UIC, number 2 would be most relevant to university archives because they deal with records from all of the units on campus. Number 3, the process of determining the market value of an item, monetary appraisal. So archivists don't necessarily determine the monetary value of collections, but they kind of do, so I kind of push back on that. The professional definition, as I mentioned, includes additional notes. But for the most part, these definitions, the 3-part definition is pretty comprehensive. In archival practice, the definitions are a way to legitimize what we do, of course. As archivists, it's said that we don't appraise for market value, but as I said earlier, I don't think that this is necessarily true. Monetary value, and particularly when you work for a university, because a university sees anything that we accession, anything that we purchase as an asset. Okay, so I've included some highlights on appraisal theory by archival scholars. In 1994, Canadian archival educator and theorist Luciana Duranty defined appraisal as appraisal is the process of establishing the value of documents made or received in the course of the conduct of affairs, qualifying that value and determining its duration. Now, Duranty still writes, so I'm sure that she has a more current definition, but this was a foundational definition in my first article. And it's sort of a positivist approach to appraisal. A positivist definition, so in traditional definition. In 2002, archival educator and scholar Richard Cox said, the archivist's act of appraising some record as archival does something to that record that no other act can do. And this certainly relates both to the power within records and the transferal of some of that power to the records professionals and their repositories. So now we're getting close to this notion of the archivist having power in the archives and to shape history. And then lastly, but not least, Canadian archivist and scholar Terry Cook describes the appraisal function and stated that as archivists appraise records, they're doing nothing less than determining what the future will know about its past. Archivists thereby co-create the archive. Appraisal is also the gateway function to all subsequent archival activity. I ask you to try to mentally return to the racial demographic charts from the beginning of my presentation. Collection development policies are in practice intended to guide appraisal or selection decisions. However, I am reminded of Sarah Ahmed's article, The Non-Performativity of Anti-Racism, because we have to consider the group of people who most often compose the documentation and collection policies in special collections and archives. And that documentation doesn't necessarily lead to meaningful action. It perhaps simply makes the composers of such documents feel as if they've done something. Continuing with the work of Terry Cook, oops, going too far. These are the 4 paradigms of appraisal. The evidence paradigm is focused on the nature of records as natural, unique, and impartial, and that it was the moral duty of the archivist as neutral custodian to defend the record's characteristics. Documentation of archival functions assists the archivist in defending selection and defending the authenticity of records. The memory paradigm, which is documented to be between the 1930s and 1970s, in the memory paradigm, we find a continued focus on European definitions of archival functions, evidentiary value, the legal aspect, and the aspect of usefulness. British archivist Hilary Jenkinson was still an influence, of course. North American archives began to make this move to a more cultural collecting. Canada was slightly ahead of us with the idea of total archives, in theory, if not in practice. Other European countries had varying approaches to appraisal. Although African and Asian countries had sophisticated systems of archival documentation, discussions on archival appraisal show up in the literature around the mid-1990s with South African archivist Vern Harris. And in the early 2000s in Zimbabwe, influenced by colonial administrations and Western ideas of archival functions, there are approaches to archival appraisal in Asia. And the article, Archival Traditions in Korean History, From Medieval Practice to the Contemporary Public Records Management Act, Yoon Ha-yoon looked at the history of practices in Korea, specifically examining how the ideological changes in various eras, such as Confucianism, colonialism, modernization, and westernization, are deeply embedded in Korea's archival history. Moving on to the identity paradigm, it was heavily influenced by other disciplines, history in particular, and included questions such as, how can we represent society more completely and directly in all its colors and shades beyond the mono-hierarchical and monochromatic picture provided by the official files? And then we have what exists now is the community paradigm. And it is what it sounds like. Archives created by community, participatory practice, which means an archival practice that might include archivists offering expertise to the community, but taking a hands-off approach to appraisal. So I'm going to focus on identity and community. The first three paradigms overlap in traditional settings. And some traditional settings have yet to even incorporate a single principle from the community participatory paradigm. We'll look at identity and community together. One of the current social movements, Black Lives Matter, highlights the importance of participatory and community archives. Whereas our university archives is currently collecting communications between Black students and faculty and university administration, we need better documentation and a stronger relationship with the Black community in Chicago in general. We have really great Black faculty, Black discipline faculty who organize and manage unique initiatives and projects. And of course, there are many special collections librarians and archivists around Chicago doing this work. But I'm speaking specifically about UIC because for a large commuter, Research One public institution, and with all of our other designations, such as being a minority serving institution, we have a poor relationship with the Black community in particular. In thinking about identity and archival appraisal, archival scholar and educator Tanya Sutherland introduced the concept of archival amnesty. Her article looks at the US history of lynching. She describes how, allied with the dominant culture and through collecting practices, archivists provided clemency to those who perpetuated racially violent crimes such as lynching. She chastises archivists for the paucity of historical records on lynching in the United States. Sutherland sees archival amnesty as an intentional turn away from the suffering of human beings and a turn away from justice and toward maintaining the status quo. Sutherland goes on to issue a call-out charge to archivists to work against white supremacist bias. Sutherland refers to the hashtag Archives for Black Lives movement that began with writing from Stacey Williams, currently at the University of Chicago, who will be speaking tomorrow, and former archivist and scholar Jarrett Drake at Harvard. Their article was published in 2017, Power to the People, Documenting Police Violence in Cleveland. Participatory community archives have a different mission than traditional archives in that they are created by community members and are appraised for local knowledge practices. According to Shilton and Srivastavanan, if archivists collaborate with community members, archivists are given the chance to assess the value of community records as the community understands them. This is not to say that traditional or academic archives are not currently doing this type of community participatory selection, but this is not the reason they exist. Community and participatory archives are grounded in appraisal by the community, which usually involves digital solutions, which in my opinion are still quite unstable. However, it seems more practical for communities that may not have a physical space. Moreover, many participatory community archival projects are supported by unreliable income sources. As a professional, I struggle with this because many associate the digital with high value. But digital tools and environments are still very much insecure and unstable, and this is often the only option for marginalized communities. So moving on, I'm putting on my special collections instructor hat. Since I've been doing a lot of work and research in culturally sustaining pedagogy, which comes out of a history of culturally relevant pedagogy from Gloria Ladson-Billings. Culturally sustaining pedagogy is explored by Django Paris and H. Sami Alim. So I'm bringing the definition of sustain into appraisal. I've been attempting to incorporate the principles of culturally sustaining pedagogy into my teaching practice. It's worth looking at the word sustain when it comes to appraisal in collection development and what that might mean for a traditional academic special collections library and university archives. Because the university, including the library, is still a site of oppression, the main way for the community participatory paradigm to be activated in this setting is if we turn inward first. to faculty, students, and staff as community. We can support traditional archives by advocating for ways to nourish or enrich the collections that we hold. And we nourish traditional archives by the inclusion of materials from underdocumented communities. Okay, you all, I included these images for the dragging component of this talk. So my community of users are mainly academic researchers, our students, discipline faculty, followed by independent, national, and international researchers, and community members. We host special groups such as middle and high school students for the history fair. My younger researchers are often more intense than my academic researchers, to be honest. I've included the likenesses of Indiana Jones and the character from Tomb Raider because the traditional archive caters to the academic researcher and dominant narratives. In some ways, by using many of our collections, researchers reactivate the power relations between the creators and the subjects. So I'm a big believer in, sort of saying things plainly and identifying my positionality and standpoint, because I think that is important. We all should recognize that. I work for a traditional academic archive. I'm the only Black woman professional in my department. So I do experience a tension between who I am and my role in administering and teaching with some of the collections that we hold. And also as someone who is a creator for rare books. I do a lot of the acquisitions for rare books currently. The things that we have in common with special collections and university archives in general are limited resources, which means understaffing, financial, and instruction. I'm currently the only special collections instructor doing library instruction, not necessarily instruction with our collections, but library instruction. We have limited space, and our space is not really accommodating to technology. We should have technology in our special collections classrooms. And then, of course, my last point, limited access to instruction technology. So again, all the principles in community archives cannot be applied in my space. In fact, I think many of the oppressed subjects in the official record are what Caribbean scholar David Scott calls conscripts of modernity. Many oppressed subjects exist in the official archival record, recruited passively, unknowingly, or against their will. And I have a connection with some of those conscripts in our collections. I also have a responsibility as a keeper and a documenter. So what I'm proposing, which is not super new, is what I'm calling intentional counter appraisal. I take the word counter from critical race theory's counter narratives, but emphasize that appraisal decisions as intentionally counter to traditional practice. Majoritarian methods purport to be neutral and objective, yet implicitly make assumptions according to negative stereotypes about people of color. So appraisal for a traditional cultural heritage memory institution, but it accepts that traditional archives and other memory institutions were not meant to be in service to the oppressed. Accepts that the function of appraisal is subjective in appraisal decisions and collection development policies. Documentation surrounding appraisal, arrangement, and description should be intentional and counter to the grand narrative. That many marginalized, oppressed subjects in traditional archives are archival conscripts. That traditional archives include knowledge of conscripted persons, but the participatory community archives paradigm is meant to counter this by being created by and embedded in community. Our archival responsibility is to make appraisal documentation and processes transparent. Some collection development policies and other policy documents are posted online so that we sort of don't have to reinvent the wheel, but there are other things that, as I mentioned earlier, other conversations that people are not privy to that happen when we make larger acquisitions and appraisal decisions. One good example for people to look at is Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia, Anti-Racist Description Resources. I would also like for us to ask ourselves who we are digitizing for. I'm a hybrid. I'm in the hybrid camp of physical materials and digitized materials, because there are a lot of people from the Black community, poor communities, who have never seen a physical historical document that would probably be pretty impressive to them. A rare book would be pretty impressive for them. So I think of digitizing being more practical for international researchers or researchers that can't make it to our institutions. And of course, now it's a lot more important because we're in the middle of a pandemic. We need to really consider different formats. So archivists and special collections librarians are already doing this, but this is for people in attendance who might not know. We need to think of a record, the definition of a record, in a different way. We also need to be better at cultivating relationships with community organizations and community members. And this is particularly important for a public institution. So the discipline faculty, which is researcher and teacher responsibility, there's the importance of historical or archival literacy in all subjects and disciplines. That means whatever discipline is your specialty, basically. Facilitating the preservation and development, and not just coming in like Indiana Jones or the Tomb Raider character and using the collections and leaving, but having a real commitment to our collections. We also need advocacy. So we need people who are going to think of themselves as a community of collections care. So we try to do preservation grants, and as everyone knows, they try to do grants for their own departments, but we need assistance too. So collaborating with us on preservation grants or acquisition grants would be fantastic. And then collaborating with special collections librarians and archivists in general. In conclusion, we are a public institutional special collections library and archives. What might intentional counter-appraisal and collecting look like? Intentional, selecting and documenting with purpose. Documenting unique stories. For example, I have been working, I believe since late 2016, early 2017, I had been working with a professor in global Asian studies who organized a global Asian performance digital archive. And we are working toward an Afro-Asian hip hop dance pedagogy at University of Illinois at Chicago, because these are the types of projects I think that sort of make us distinctive from those elite institutions, is collecting those unique relationships and documenting those unique relationships that we have on campus. Collections that are appraising that is counter to majoritarian methods in archives, something that is student-centered and community-centered. I also have, something going that I'm going to pass off on to my colleague, who you'll hear from later, in university archives, is a student zine collection. So this brings us to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening, and I'm ready for any questions.
Yes, Kellee, thank you so much for your presentation. It was so stimulating and interesting. And for those of you who may have missed it, we look forward to having questions, which you can post in the chat. I'm going to pose those for Kellee. So we have one that just came up from Dan Harper concerning the idea of creating a different definition of a record. What, in your opinion, would that look like?
So basically, Dan, thank you for the question. Basically, what we're looking at is, we're looking to marginalized or underrepresented communities of what a record may be to them, what their definition of a record is. So a record could be a dance performance instead of like a physical traditional record. I'm a believer in, from my reading, I'm a believer that we hold, and not just, our reading, but to the people that I'm attached to the Black diaspora that I'm attached to, that the archive is in the body. So I think that we need to look toward, other communities and underdocumented communities as to how they define what a record is.
Thank you for that. Kellee, I had a question that is somewhat related to that, and your stimulating talk has gotten me thinking about a lot of different angles on this, but I was wondering, we're kind of getting at this toward the end, but maybe there's more that you could expand on here. What do you think the long-term impact of diversification at the level of staff special collections might make on what the content of those collections could look like over time? I guess this is a question about like, oh, there you are, hi. This is a question about collecting methods, I guess, but also a question of the actual content. What would be, I guess, perhaps your dream for what the collection would actually look like?
That's an interesting question. Because archives and special collections are so sort of complex, and then in the Chicagoland area, we have so many different repositories with different collecting focus. It's kind of a challenge to sort of navigate how we collect. And I think at this particular time, our collecting focus is so broad. It is the 20th and 21st century history of Chicago. That's very broad. We do have some details in our specific details, but that's our broad collecting focus. If we, as you know, it doesn't matter really how many diverse bodies we add to our units in the university. It matters if those bodies, if those people are able to make decisions. So I think of the archive in general as partial. So if we add more professionals who are from different backgrounds and different communities, I think that we would get a more whole representation of, of history, of documentation.
Great, thank you. Carl Lennon has some extension of this. He says, thank you for a wonderful and pointed introduction to critical issues in archival appraisal. I was struck by your discussion of counter-appraisal and community collecting, and I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that in the context of white-centric legacies and traditional archival functions of top-down collecting, to name two examples. The library we both work in is named after Richard J. Daley, and acquiring and processing the Daley family collections continues to be a major focus for library resources.
Right. So Carl is very aware, as of course some of my colleagues in attendance are very aware, is that, you know, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, that archivists are aligned with power. So and the university is, power-based institution. So the only way to sort of subvert those things is to, um, have people that are part of the community, whether that be disciplined faculty or whether that be us in the library, who are intentionally looking to document um, those different stories. And that's as simply as I can put it. It's not a complex thing to do. It is simply looking at our position in the city, in the cultural hub of Illinois, and looking out for those stories and sort of fleshing out our collections. I will tell you, I love stories. So I'll go back to a story between Mark and I and us organizing for this conference. And I was frustrated at particular points because we got to a point where we were supposed to create an exhibit and found that there were serious gaps in our collection. Like it was going to take, we couldn't simply go to 4 collections and say, hey, we can create an exhibit from these 4 collections because they're very relevant to the themes in the conference. It was probably going to take us maybe 12 to 15 different collections to pick little pieces out. So it was going to take in-depth research in order to create an exhibit for this particular conference. I hope that answers the question, Carl.
Thank you, Kellee. There is a question from G. Jordan Williams, and great to have you joining us. Thank you, Professor Warren, he says. Question, in what ways can records professionals be of more assistance to a community when appraising and managing a local heritage archive? In what ways can we continue to cede power to the community and take more of a supporting role?
Hi, G. Jordan. I love this question. So I think that, first of all, when universities plot themselves in the middle of a community, that they have a responsibility to that community. Also, I think it goes back, and I think G. Jordan is well aware of this, as some of my other colleagues in the field, is that it really, things really start to happen when we have the staff. I'm one person, but I have all of these ideas. I wish I could go out and, have time to sort of cultivate these relationships in the community, but I also have my community of researchers on campus. I have my community of international researchers, national researchers. I have rare book curation to do. I have scholarship to do. So there are lots of things on my plate. I think that if there is the staff and there's a designated individual, then absolutely, I think that we would be in a position to sort of help support community, not take over and not direct them to what their needs might be, but simply, sort of supporting them. And I actually did, a couple of years ago now, I actually did an archival workshop. And I did it in cooperation with the Women's Leadership and Resource Center on campus with Professor Natalie Bennett. And I hosted an archival workshop, and we had free archival half boxes and an archival folder and some archival gloves. And I was offering my expertise on how to preserve those personal family items that might be important to community members. And this was hosted at the Hyde Park Arts Center. Okay, so sorry, I went a little longer, but I hope that answers your question, G. Jordan. I think you have some idea though, G. Jordan.
Thank you, Kellee, for that. Gretchen Neidhart is with us. Hi, Gretchen. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for your amazing talk, Kellee. She says, would you talk a little bit about outreach to researchers? Just as an aside, this sounds like a question that's partly about people like me. I feel like we have so many folks who only visit a few times. How can we bring these ideas to them? Is that a group you would prioritize reaching? Or would you advocate outreach to folks who aren't visiting at all, or those who come to us regularly? With limited resources, it's often hard to figure out what to prioritize.
I mean, Gretchen, you know, in an ideal world, we would have all of the resources. And thank you for your question, but you absolutely know if we had, you know, even a little bit more, even if we had a little bit more, we would be able to do appropriate outreach. But we're in reality. We have to think about that. So, you know, I'm a believer in sort of low hanging fruit. When I first started my position at the university library, this is my third career, by the way. So my second career, I was an independent contractor. I was an entrepreneur. So I was used to sort of reaching out to people on my own. And so it takes a little bit of that independent spirit to reach out to individuals. I was cold emailing discipline faculty, trying to connect with them, my research interests to their research interests. Sometimes that worked, sometimes it didn't. So I think that I think oftentimes, and I say this quite a bit when I'm doing presentations on instruction, is that I think sometimes we try to look for ways to standardize things. And I think this stops us from creating sort of authentic community and authentic relationships. So start with the people that are closest to you. And then, you know, with our sort of fluctuating resource circumstances, you know, once we get more staff or once we get more faculty, then try to shift your focus to those people that maybe we don't reach that often. I hope that gets at what you were asking, Gretchen. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Kellee. We have another great question here. This one is from Lori Moses. Thanks for joining us, Lori. I felt that appraisal was sort of glossed over in my LIS education. Are there new approaches that are being incorporated into these programs of study?
I mean, the sort of in my research on appraisal, the last sort of paradigm and the reason why I'm focusing on a more intentional and counter appraisal is that it's just going to be a continuous topic of conversation. New approaches would sort of be in the area of what I mentioned, intentional and counter, and focusing on the communities that you are embedded in. If I didn't make this clear at the end of my conclusion, I think that the sort of thing that UIC can do maybe better than some of the elite institutions is create archives that are generated from our student body and discipline faculty. That's not necessarily to say that you know, we won't supplement our other collections, which are manuscript collections and rare books, with other things. So in my work as doing acquisitions for rare books, I'm looking at supplementing our rare book collection with book artists from Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. So that's how I'm sort of nourishing our rare book collection, is adding those voices to our rare book collection. So appraisal, it probably is glossed over in LIS education because I think, you know, if you're not really focused on it, there's sort of the research side of your LIST program, and then there's the practical side. So it's almost like nursing in a way, where there's this hands-on, you know, practical approach, clinical approach, and then there's the side where you're going to be a, you know, sort of doing nursing informatics or something like that. So appraisal, you know, out of all the things that have to be covered in a 2-year program, you know, appraisal is probably mentioned briefly. You really have to be looking for it. Thanks, Lori.
I actually have a little follow-up to that one, because this question of appraisal is just really, really interesting. And we have another question coming in, but let me quickly ask this one as a follow-up. The question of appraisal is just so interesting, and reflecting on your own acquisitions, Kellee, I was wondering if your own recent acquisitions, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the way that appraisal has to do with some kind of judgment about, it sounds like it involves some kind of judgment about the present cultural value of something and the expectation of some kind of future value. And how do you do that? How do you make decisions in this way? Because these sound like really important acquisitions you're making, but how do you do that? How do you decide this one versus that one?
I mean, it is like, I guess it's like any other profession, that you sort of have to embed yourself in the people who belong to that particular community. So I was able to meet, and it was embarrassing for me because I'm still in this sort of category of early career, but I was able to, I mentioned an information professional scholar by the name of Jesse Erickson, and him and another special collections librarian at the University of Delaware, Curtis Smalls, they hosted a conference on Black bibliographia, and that's actually the first time that I saw Meredith McGill speak. And so I met a few people at that conference who have been doing the work for years. For example, Amos Paul Kennedy Jr., who does letterpress art and letterpress prints and book arts. He's been around for quite a long time, and I met him for the first time at the conference that was hosted at the University of Delaware. And I think maybe he was like, oh, she's cute, because I was like, oh my goodness, you're amazing, you're unbelievable. And he's been around for quite a long time. So it's embedding yourself in the community, creating relationships with these individuals. There's an amazing book artist that Mr. Kennedy turned me on to, who is actually in Evanston. He's a letterpress artist. He has a workshop, and his name is Ben Blount. And so we will be collecting materials from Ben Blount. Amazing work. I was able, in the midst of this pandemic, to go up to Evanston and see his workshop and some of his work. So we will have some of those materials for the students. But that's always sort of the complication mark, is that, you know, you're dealing with the present moment, but then you also sort of have to project into the future. I think, I don't mean to, you know, pop my collar, but I think that Black people are really good at that. And the work that Ben Blount is doing is sort of phenomenal, and it's in step with the social movements that are happening right now. And libraries are definitely in the business, and special collections librarians in particular are in the business of collecting social movements.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, it's just a topic that always interests me, like this, the process of appraisal and acquisition. So that's really insightful. We have a question from Lauren McDaniel. Thanks for joining us, Lauren. She's asking, so many university libraries, not just public ones, are grossly understaffed to the detriment of users and materials, therefore the humanities. Part of this is that archival labor too is misunderstood and undervalued. And she says, thank you for this talk and explaining the crucial work that we archivists do. It's not quite a question, but maybe you wanted to chime in there about this question of valuing the archival, the work, the labor that is happening here.
Yeah, I think that, thank you, Lauren, for that comment. And I think that was one of the sort of main ideas that Mark and I wanted to get across, is that, you know, I think a lot of discipline faculty don't understand how the library overall fits into the structure of the university. And oftentimes we're thought of as second tier faculty, second tier staff. And that's of course reflected in all of the categories that we fit in. Not all university librarians are in the category of faculty. Some universities put them in as staff and, you know, various other titles. So I thought with this conference, it was very important to communicate to discipline faculty that we are scholars, that we have these conversations, that we are grossly, as you put it, grossly understaffed. And that sort of affects how history is made. It affects how it affects access. It affects how we schedule instruction. Particularly now, it really affects access in the midst of this pandemic. So still very excited to continue our conversation, but thank you for your comment again.
Yes, thank you for that. And I wanted to pick up on something that came into the Q&A. I've been sort of neglecting the Q&A because I've been looking at the chat. But an anonymous attendee, hello anonymous, thank you for joining us, is asking, as a representative of the institution with its attended power dynamic, how do you go about creating relationships with external communities? It's a really great question.
I realize that I work for the community. I mean, I work for the institution, and I, you know, as I mentioned in part of my presentation, that, you know, I understand my position. My position is pretty unique and pretty rare that I have a position in special collections overall. I understand that sort of power dynamic, but I belong to the Black community. So, you know, as far as creating those relationships, you simply have to talk to people. I don't go to communities thinking that I'm going to take something from the community. I'm thinking about what I can actually give to the community when I have time. This is something that I learned, like I said, from a previous career, is this sort of service aspect of anything that you do in life. And then also too, I'm not, you know, on a personal level, I'm not super duper religious, but had a religious background and upbringing. And service is definitely a part of the Black church. So it's kind of in my DNA, but yes, in a sense, I am an agent of the state, even though my position is, I don't think it's very secure. So I don't have the same sorts of ideas that maybe a white faculty member might have. I'm tenure track. My position is still, it's not stable. It's not secure. So I don't, it's a complex, there are levels to it, anonymous. Thank you though for your question.
Thank you for that. We have sort of a follow-up question to that one from Linda Narrow. Hi, Linda, thanks for joining us. She says, thank you for a thought-provoking presentation. This question follows onto the comments you're making now. Can you discuss how archivists can approach and work with communities to gain their trust in the institutions that are interested in collecting their archives? So once again, a kind of, a trust issue, representation issue.
So I think it starts with actually figuring out what community organizations are still active and, approaching them in a way that says, what can we do for you? What do we have? What sort of services do we have? What do we have? What can we offer you? And not really seeking to collect the community organization's history, but helping them to preserve their own history. So therefore, if eventually it turns out that they don't have the space or they don't have the bandwidth to manage their own, materials, that maybe they would think of us as a place, as a secure place to, be the custodians for their materials. But we don't, at the outset, we don't have that expectation that we're going to get something from them. Thank you, Linda.
We have just a couple of comments in the chat here to chime in here. G. Jordan mentioned the coming from a place of humility, that interpersonal skills can go a long way. And I think, that is definitely an important part of what I see from Kellee, that you have that ability to connect to people. And TK, hi TK, TK is chiming in here and thanking you for sharing that vulnerability within the institution. I think that really needs to be acknowledged here. We also, Aisha Haikal, thank you for posting this. We have a URL here posted to the Black Bibliographia conference that you were mentioning. So people who are interested in that might want to just click on that URL. It was clearly a fantastic conference. Do we have any more questions? I do want to once again give a very, very warm thank you to Kellee for a fantastic talk, and thank all of you for sharing your thoughts and asking such great and stimulating questions. And just for coming, for joining in the conference so far. I'm Mark Canuel. I'm director of the Institute for the Humanities at UIC, and I am collaborating with Professor Kellee Warren from the UIC Library Special Collections. And welcome back to Different Archives, Different Histories. And to our panel, our first panel for the conference, following up on a fantastic keynote by Professor Warren. This panel is called Value, Politics, and the Archive. We have a couple of reminders that we're going to be posting in the chat, but I'd just like to highlight one of those, which is that during and after the panel, you can post questions in the chat. We kind of prefer that rather than posting in the Q&A section, just because they, it's like looking at both can be a little bit confusing. So if you can do it in the chat, that'll be wonderful. Moderating this session will be Professor Raphael Magarik. He is a specialist in early modern British literature, the Bible and religious history, and also author of numerous stimulating articles on religion, politics, etc., many interesting topics in the popular press. So thank you, Rafi, for taking over moderating this panel. I'm going to hand the mic over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's an absolute pleasure and a privilege to introduce our three distinguished panelists, which I will do now all together before the talks. So Katharine Gerbner is Associate Professor of History at the University of Minnesota. Her research explores the history of religion and race in early America and the Caribbean. Her first book, published in 2018, is entitled Christian Slavery, Conversion, and Race in the Protestant Atlantic World. She has previously written articles about Obeah, Quaker slavery, print culture, and theories of conversion. Her current project, Constructing Religion, Defining Crime, examines how Black religious practices under slavery were excluded from emerging categories of religion. Second, Meredith McGill teaches American literature at Rutgers University and is the co-director with Jacqueline Goldsby of the Black Bibliography Project. She is the author of American Literature and the Culture of Reprinting, 1834 through 1853, a study of 19th century American resistance to tight control over intellectual property. And she's the editor of two collections of essays, The Traffic in Poems, 19th Century Poetry and Transatlantic Exchange, as well as Taking Liberties with the Author. In addition to essays on 19th century poetry and poetics, she has published widely on intellectual property, authorship, and the history of the book. And finally, TK Sangwan is a certified archivist, librarian, and DJ. Over the past 10 years, she's worked with UCLA and UT Austin to build preservation partnerships for human rights documentation and cultural heritage materials in the United States, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. She holds an MLIS and an MA in Latin American Studies from UCLA. In 2017, she was named a Fulbright Specialist in Library and Information Science. And 2018 through 19, she was a Fulbright Scholar with Mexico's Ministry of Culture. Since 2001, TK has worked in community radio and currently hosts the program, The Archive of Feelings, on dublab.com. I hope you'll join me in welcoming our panelists, and I'll turn things over to Professor Gerbner.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thanks so much to the organizers for inviting me to participate in today's conversation, which is incredibly timely and incredibly important. And I want to just begin by situating myself. I'm speaking to you from my home in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm about 3 miles from the site where George Floyd was murdered earlier this year, and as a member of the history department at the University of Minnesota, I also want to acknowledge that this land-grant university sits on Dakota land, as does my house. And then I'm going to go ahead and screen share. And as I do that, I'm going to so can you see? There we go. So my presentation today begins with a sale. In 2011, the Beinecke Library at Yale purchased a manuscript collection through a private sale at Sotheby's London. The collection, known as the Thomas Thistlewood Papers, included nearly 10,000 pages written by Thistlewood, an English overseer turned enslaver who lived in Jamaica from 1750 until his death in 1786. The Thistlewood Papers sold for an undisclosed sum, but it was likely 5, probably more like 6 figures. And after the sale, they were shipped from the Lincolnshire County Archives in England to the Beinecke Library in New Haven, Connecticut. So since moving to Yale, archivists have carefully cataloged and digitized the documents so scholars can now access and examine high-resolution images for free. Yet even before they were digitized, the Thistlewood papers had made a mark on narratives about slavery and enslaved life. Over the past 3 decades, they've been the subject of dozens of articles and books and have drawn the attention of prize-winning novelists like Marlon James and Zadie Smith. My presentation today uses the Thistlewood papers as a case study to ask questions about the relationship between archives, ethics, and value. And I do so by examining 2 interconnected themes. First, I briefly discuss the ethical questions raised by using sources like the Thistlewood diaries. And second, I examine the relationship between archival value and inheritance. I'm especially interested in how the value of the Thistlewood archive has changed over time. Largely, I'd argue, as a result of the labor of Caribbean archivists and historians. I'll end by considering how these questions about archival value can open up new ways to think about reparations. So first, let's begin with the creation of this archive. Thistlewood, the man who wrote the words on the pages that were sold to Yale in 2011, was born in Lincolnshire, England in 1721 and sailed to Jamaica in 1750, where he spent the rest of his life. He was not a particularly remarkable individual, aside from the fact that he kept a daily journal that he wrote in obsessively, recording basic facts about each day, including the weather, his dinner guests, and most infamously, his description of sadistic punishments and his notations in Latin about the women he coerced into sex. Among the many deeply problematic aspects of the diaries is the fact that it gives historians and other scholars access to names and numbers. Thus, the author of the most widely read monograph about Thistlewood is able to calculate that Thistlewood had sex 3,852 times during his 38 years in Jamaica. And I could go into more details, but I'm going to stop there and just say that the data that it's possible to create from Thistlewood's records is deeply problematic. Saidiya Hartman, who was referenced earlier already, I feel like we might be hearing more about her throughout these 2 days, wrote about Thistlewood in her seminal essay, Venus in 2 Acts. And she articulates this problem clearly. While the daily record of abuses, she writes, constitutes a history of slavery, the more difficult task is to exhume the lives buried under this prose, or rather to accept that Phoeba and Dido, these are 2 enslaved women who are referenced in Thistlewood's journal, exist only within the confines of these words, and that this is the manner in which they enter history. The dream is to liberate them from the obscene descriptions that first introduced them to us. It is too easy to hate a man like Thistlewood. What is more difficult is to acknowledge as our inheritance the brutal Latin phrases spilling onto the pages of his journals. Hartman's challenge to exhume the lives buried under this prose represents an ethical project as much as a historical one. And it's an ethical project that has been taken up by a number of incredible scholars, including our keynote speaker this afternoon, Dr. Fuentes. But today, I want to linger on Hartman's second point in this passage about our inheritance of these journals. And in doing so, I want to address the multivalent meanings of inheritance, to think not only about the intellectual and psychic inheritance of the Thistlewood diaries, but also about the manuscripts as a material inheritance. I'm interested in how they have been valued, both in terms of knowledge production and also in terms of money. So the second part of my presentation begins with Thistlewood's death and follows the physical diaries through space and time. When Thomas Thistlewood died in 1786, he left an estate worth £2,408. His diaries were not included in the monetary value of the estate, but they were important enough to be shipped back to his family in Lincolnshire, England. They were passed down to Thistlewood's nephew, William, before making their way to Thistlewood's great niece, a woman who is not named in the records. In the 1850s, we find the first effort to place a monetary value on the journals. The details are unclear, but we know that when her husband died, Thistlewood's great niece fought to maintain possession of the journals. In a letter from 1853, a dealer wrote that Thistlewood's great niece was, quote, very poor, and that she would only part with the manuscripts for a price. quote, something over the price of waste paper, he suggested. We do not know whether Thistlewood's great niece ever received money for these documents, but if she did, it was probably not much. Still, despite the lack of specifics, this moment offers us an opportunity to reflect upon value, inheritance, and archives during this mid-19th century moment. Here is a collection which we know contains brutal details about the banal evil of slavery, which was transported from Jamaica to Lincolnshire, England, and passed down through the Thistlewood family. Thus, on the most obvious level, we see descendants of an enslaver benefiting, if even minimally, from an archive created through brutality. On another level, we see the dynamics of patriarchy within 19th century England. A woman who is never named, who is, I think we can say, kind of tricked out of this deeply problematic inheritance. And then there are dealers who traffic in these documents, trying to make a profit as they move the manuscripts around. The dealers who acquired the Thistlewood collection sold them to Lord Monson, the 6th Baron Monson of Lincolnshire, England, who was interested in material related to Lincolnshire, politics, and hunting. And here you can see their sort of inscription onto the actual physical documents. Thistlewood's manuscripts were an unusual acquisition, and and Lord Monson probably purchased them not because they provided insight to enslaved life, but because they belonged to a Lincolnshire family and because Thistlewood had one journal devoted to hunting and gaming. For the next century, Thistlewood's journals were then held at the Monson family's estate until 1951, when they were moved along with the rest of the Monson collection to the Lincolnshire County Archives, where they were placed on deposit. And significantly, this means that they were still owned by the Monsons, but the county archives was given responsibility for archiving, cataloging, and storing the journals. There they sat at the Lincolnshire Archives for about 2 decades before a Jamaican archivist found them and recognized their significance for the study of slavery and Caribbean history. Kenneth Ingram, the campus librarian at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus, who helped to establish the West Indies and special collections at UWI Mona in 1974, spent several years traveling to remote archives to identify manuscript sources about Jamaican history. Ingram doesn't say how he found the Thistlewood collection, but he certainly got help from the archivist at the Lincolnshire County Archives, at the very least through their catalog description, which noted that the diaries were, quote, concerned with life in Jamaica and that they were a full and interesting record. In Ingram's Bibliography, published in 1976, he expanded upon this description with nearly 3 full pages devoted to the diaries, noting that they, quote, may well be said to be a unique record in the sources of Jamaican social and economic history. And Ingram did more than write about the journals. He talked about them and encouraged other scholars to consult them. And Caribbean historians and scholars immediately recognized the value of Ingram's labor. Elsa Govaya, a path-breaking scholar and the first woman to earn a chair in history at the University of the West Indies, wrote that Ingram had brought a treasure trove to the light of day through his unstinting devotion to the cultivation of productive scholarship. And nearly all of the reviews that were published of Ingram's bibliography use words like labor and devotion and love to describe it. And indeed, his passion didn't end with the bibliography. In his conversations with other scholars, he provided unparalleled insight to the opportunities for doing innovative research with archival collections that, in most cases, were created in Jamaica before being transported across the Atlantic and eventually deposited in British archives. One of Ingram's frequent conversation partners was Douglas Hall, a Jamaican historian and the first Caribbean-born scholar to become a professor and head of a department at the University of the West Indies. He was the first scholar to publish a monograph on the records, and the resulting book was In Miserable Slavery, Thomas Thistlewood in Jamaica, 1750 to 86, which was an annotated and abridged transcription of the Thistlewood journals. So it was thanks to Ingram's intrepid search for unknown manuscript collections and Hall's publication of this abridged transcription that Thistlewood and his journals became increasingly well known within the fields of Atlantic and Caribbean history. Since the 1990s, In Miserable Slavery came out in 1988, dozens of scholars have focused their attention on the journals, and their labor has in turn offered new insights into the history of slavery, as well as pointed to challenges to understanding the nature of the archive and questioning the ethics of using archival collections like the Thistlewood Diaries. So what this means is that by 2011, when the Monson family decided to sell their manuscript collections, the accumulation of scholarly labor had brought the Thistlewood Diaries out of, I can say, I think, near obscurity, and made them into one of the most important collections for the history of slavery and enslaved life. Thus, while the Thistlewood Diaries were themselves only a small part of the Monson collection, they likely brought the greatest ROI, or return on investment, for the Monson family, having increased in value from just above waste paper to tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. So how should we interpret this sale? In order to answer this question, I want to return to Saidiya Hartman and the last sentence of the quotation I read earlier. "It is too easy to hate a man like Thistlewood. What is more difficult is to acknowledge as our inheritance the brutal Latin phrases spilling onto the pages of his journals." What does it mean to acknowledge an inheritance? And what is an inheritance? Hartman alludes to the Latin phrases. That is part of our inheritance, the inheritance of white supremacy, of Eurocentrism, and of patriarchy. But inheritance also refers to wealth that is passed down through generations. Here we can look at the Thistlewood Diaries in a different light. In examining the material history of the Thistlewood papers, we see the documents increasing in value from nothing to thousands, after archivists and scholars labored to demonstrate their value. In other words, inheritance is both passed down and actively created. And this is not just the story about the Thistlewood papers. As scholars have asked different questions about the past and sought to center Black experiences, archivists and other scholars have found new records that offer different kinds of information. As a result, these collections have become much, much more valuable. An analysis of manuscripts sold at auction shows that the market has followed the scholarship. Manuscripts related to the Caribbean and the African diaspora have increased in value roughly 50-fold since the 1980s. Here we see how scholarship affects the creation of new markets and the cultivation of new archival collections in major libraries, like the Beinecke. So in other words, scholars, historians, and scholar archivists have created this new inheritance. The value of our work is not only knowledge production, but also monetary production, wealth. And so I think it behooves us to ask, for whom are we creating wealth? In the case of the Thistlewood Diaries, it's wealth that has been reaped for the Monson family. In other cases, the profits from the sale of slavery archives go directly to the descendants of enslavers, which I think we can all agree is the opposite of reparations. But acknowledging this reality and our role within the process of wealth creation, I think also opens up new possibilities for reparative work. And I'll end with several kind of open-ended questions that I've been pondering. What can we do to repair the disparities of wealth stemming from the archives that we use and preserve? What leverage do we have as scholars when we recognize the wealth that we are creating with our scholarship and our labor? And finally, what would it mean for the archives of slavery to be sold in a way that furthered reparative efforts and acknowledged this messy inheritance? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now hear from Meredith McGill.
Terrific, thanks. Let me take a minute to share my screen. Does that look, does everybody see that? I hope. Great. Can I get a thumbs up? Can you see the, great, thanks, terrific. It's thrilling to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really indebted to you and really look forward to this, continuing the conversation. I want to begin by acknowledging that though I'm presenting by myself today, the project I'll be describing is a deeply collaborative one. Indeed, many of these ideas and indeed formulations belong to Jackie Goldsby, my co-director and longtime collaborator, and to the team of rare book catalogers, metadata specialists, and graduate student researchers who've been working together on the Black Bibliography Project. And here just is our website, just for future reference. The Black Bibliography Project, or BBP, is a database of rare book level metadata about Black print, organized according to the principles of linked data. And this is our data portal, just so you can get a look at it. In 2019, we received a grant from the Mellon Foundation to develop a pilot program, that is to develop a data model for the description of books and periodicals, but also to experiment with instruction in the principles of bibliographic description. When it comes to bibliography, students of African American literature face a familiar dilemma. While comprehensive description of the material aspects of African American literary texts is long overdue, mere inclusion in the field under current norms of practice turns out to be insufficient for Black print materials, which challenge the ordinary business of bibliographic description at every turn. There is, of course, an historical explanation for the scarcity of reliable bibliographic information about books written by Black authors. The opening of the literary canon to writers of color coincided in the late 20th century with a decline in the scholarly practice of descriptive bibliography, that is, the systematic study of books as physical objects. This divided path has produced significant unevenness in the resources available to scholars of African American literature, arguably reinstituting a color line that needlessly hampers the growth of African American literary studies. Despite the disappearance of bibliographical instruction from our graduate programs, the literary criticism of canonical white writers continues to be buttressed by authoritative accounts of the production and transmission of their texts, whether or not critics are aware of this fact. For instance, the groundbreaking Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson electronic archives rest on decades of meticulous, old-fashioned bibliographic scholarship. By contrast, scholars studying African American and Black diaspora literatures are often forced to sort out complex and confusing publication histories on their own because standard bibliographic sources often don't include Black writers within their canonical range. For instance, the 9-volume Bibliography of American Literature, known to scholars as the BAL, provides comprehensive bibliographic information for American authors of belletristic works who died before 1930. It includes phenomenally detailed records on more than 23,000 individual volumes. However, due to what now seems like a narrow definition of literariness, an emphasis on elite print sources, as well as ignorance of a wide range of African American writing, only a single African American author, see if you can guess it, earned entry into its ranks. It surprised me to learn this, but it's Paul Laurence Dunbar. A closer look at the BAL entry on Dunbar gives a good sense of why descriptive bibliography can be such a valuable tool for literary scholars. After extensive research in numerous archives, collating physical descriptions of multiple editions of Dunbar's books, double-checking publication information against copyright deposits, advertisements in the trade press, and personal correspondence, the editors of the BAL established an authoritative history of publication of first editions of Dunbar's work. Each entry provides a wealth of information to enable scholars, collectors, and catalogers to identify the edition to which the copy they hold in their hand belongs. The entry for Dunbar's best-known work of poetry, Lyrics of Lowly Life, supplies publication information, pagination, information about the size, watermark, and quality of paper, a signature collation, that is, a description of how the leaves were printed, folded, and stitched together, and details about binding and end papers, corroborating publication information from Publishers Weekly, and a list of copies consulted. It's an astonishing piece of work. Dunbar's BAL entry is clearly a goldmine for scholars as well as for collectors and catalogers. Having this kind of information at our fingertips could change how we think about African American authors, texts, and their audiences. To give just one example, lists of works by the 19th century poet Frances Harper treat all of the works they itemize as books. But the collections of poetry she published early in her career aren't actually books at all, but rather small pamphlets that broadcast in their physical formats assumptions about the cultural role of poetry that are sharply different from the work she published later on in her career. Poems on Miscellaneous Subjects, which was printed numerous times between 1854 and 1874, is comprised of 3 signatures or gatherings. It's sewn in a stab binding with a pasted on paper cover. published in small print runs in successive batches to be given away or sold at her anti-slavery lectures with no copyright notice overleaf. This pamphlet bears in its print format the traces of a strong relationship to oral performance, to the miscellaneous meetings of reformers that were brought under the umbrella of anti-slavery, and to the songs that were sung and the songsters that provided a text held in common at these meetings. Compare them to these 1895 and 1900 editions of the poems, with their floral image illustrated cloth covers, 3/4 length author photo, facsimile signature, and copyright registration. These books mobilize a significantly different set of expectations as to what will be found in their pages, suggesting parlor display rather than activist uses, individual authorship, and silent reading rather than the work of collectives who gather to forge and sustain common aspirations. Remarkable as it would be to have a BAL for Black authored texts, Jackie and I have come to realize that descriptive bibliographies of white authors reflect assumptions that chafe against the realities of what it took for Black authors to get into print. Moreover, they don't reflect the values that the African-American scholarly and curatorial communities have long brought to the practice of preserving Black texts. Most bibliographic reference works are author-centered, subordinating other actors, if they're named at all, to the story of the individual creator. They fail to reflect what John Ernest called, in one of our early planning workshops, the accomplished communities that enabled Black writers to find an audience. Most descriptive bibliographies also privilege works published in the book format, whereas vital stores of Black literature, essays, poetry, short stories, drama, serialized novels, these works reached readers in newspapers, periodicals, and pamphlets. Separating first editions from reprints, as the BAL does, might be helpful for collectors trying to determine the value of a particular copy. But it distorts the picture scholars need to assemble of that text circulation, its relationship to oral performance, and its uptake into an array of different formats and editions. Traditional bibliography winnows and straightens out the often convoluted pathways of a text circulation. It tells the story of publication as an enumerated list of firsts, belying the overlapping history of reprints and reissues, excerpts, lags, redundancies, and revivals that so often define the life cycles of Black print. Black print frequently circulates outside of and below the radar of mainstream publishing houses and trade journals. Black print culture intersects with that of white authors and white publishers, but it has its own tempo, its own pressures to negotiate, and it requires a different set of institutional structures and alliances to thrive and survive. What bibliographical model could capture and distill this flux while also reflecting Black print culture's particular modes of literary production? Our hunch was that we could adapt bibliographic norms to the realities of Black print by drawing on the capacities of digital media. Unlike codex bibliographies, a digital bibliographic database can be queryable, expandable, revisable, and reorganizable, that is, no longer ordered only by the lives of authors. Collaborating with an ACE team of catalogers and metadata specialists, in partnership with scholars, curators, and librarians across the country, we've begun to develop a database that we hope will be better suited to Black print, one that harnesses the capacities of linked data to shift the locus of bibliographic value from books as objects to the networks of human and institutional actors who create and sustain literary culture. For those of you who create or maintain metadata, already know this, but linked data describes a technique for recording meaningful relationships between data points expressed as triples, or sets of 3 terms. For instance, to render basic information about Frederick Douglass's most famous book into linked data form, one would need to teach the computer some pretty basic things, creating a set of statements such as, Frederick Douglass is an instance of a human. Narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass is an instance of a work. Frederick Douglass is the author of Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, and so forth. Those are triples. Linked data inscribes relationships into data as it is recorded. Rather than offering a flat field of information for keyword searching, linked data schemes record meaningful or semantic links between data points. These relationships themselves are then machine readable. Linked data structures enable us to search for information according to the relationships our data scheme encodes. Which 19th century Black authored books were published in paper covers and which in cloth bindings? Which slave narratives had copyrights taken out in the name of their authors and which in the name of publishers or of institutions? Were mid-20th century Black novels more likely to be published in New York, Chicago, or Atlanta? If we record information about binding styles, copyright statements, genre, and places of publication in linked data form, the relationships between and among these data points becomes searchable. The BBP is still very much in early stages of development. We're using Wikibase software to collect and store our data, and we're currently refining our data model as we test it against different print formats. We're using a three-part structure for data entry, one that treats each text that we record as a work, as an edition, and as an individual copy. Traditional descriptive bibliography takes as its principal terms the edition and the copy. Its aim is to tell a coherent story about the history of publication of a text, and to enable the scholar, curator, or collector to determine the relationship between the copy of a book they hold in their hand and the edition of which it is a part. For the BBP's database, however, we wanted to include bibliographical data about reprints along with first editions, and we wanted to be able to track the migration of Black authored texts across print formats and across non-print media. For these reasons, we added a data entry level we call the work, an abstraction that's implicit in bibliographic practice, but that doesn't actually represent something concrete. It doesn't represent a production process or an object you can hold in your hand. In the BBP's linked data model, adding work as a level of description that's unattached to an actual physical objects allows us to stretch descriptive bibliography to encompass non-print media, to register the transit of literary works across oral performance, radio, film, and TV. That's our fantasy. We haven't done that yet, although we're developing a data model for orature. Fundamental attributes that we attach to the record of a work include the author, the literary form, and the language a text is written in. These attributes are likely to stay stable as the work appears in multiple editions, in other formats, and across media. There are two important implications to the linking power of work as a data category. First, by always attaching the author to the work, our model prioritizes and honors the agency of Black writers. We encountered this issue when at one data entry workshop, we realized that Wikibase's contributor category gave Black writers and white editors and publishers equivalent status in relationship to the work. In Wikibase's data ontology, the term contributor is neutral, but for Black print culture, it's charged and laden with racialized power. So by attaching the attribute author to the work, our database foregrounds the struggles of Black writers to receive and retain credit where it's due. Second, by linking our descriptions of the edition and the copy to the abstract category of the work, we will be able to include orature and other kinds of non-print media in our database. We use the conventional bibliographic definition of edition for the next level of data recording. And that definition is all copies printed at any time or times from one setting of type without substantial change. Dozens of attributes can be recorded at this level, from the standard notations of place, year, and publisher, to a more detailed accounting of those who produce the book as object, including the printer, the stereotyper, the illustrators, engravers, and numerous persons who, while not immediately engaged in the physical production of the book, are noted in texts as instrumental to publication. For instance, translators, editors, dedicatees, writers of forewords, introductions, and afterwords. We also record a number of material facts about the edition, including frontispieces, illustrations, and the number of pages recorded as a cataloger's extent statement. We've created a separate data model to record the presence of and describe dust jackets because they're vital to 20th century African American texts. But their separate publication process and their tendency to get wrapped around the wrong edition make them questionably defined as part of a particular print run. We plan to link book jacket data to descriptions of particular copies. Almost finished here. At the copy level, we record information that distinguishes the copy we're holding in hand. Here we enter descriptions of the binding, height and width of the book, its condition, the collection to which it belongs, and its shelf mark if it belongs to a library or archive. The copy level is where the copy level is where we record the names of the persons and institutions who've been responsible for preserving a book and making it possible for us to consult it. And here's some, just a view of the copy level descriptive categories. We record as much provenance information as we possibly can, including institutional marks, formal inscriptions, and the names of former owners scrawled on flyleaves. The history of a book's transit to and through library collections often provides eloquent, if tacit, testimony. The hands through which Black authored books have passed and the history of these books' classification is a vital part of their histories. We are excited about our database's capacity to forge links between printed texts and the persons and institutions which have preserved them. Well, we have been drawing on Wikidata and the Library of Congress's name authority file to establish and disambiguate the individuals and institutions inscribed within or on the books we describe. Only about 75% of these names can be found in the authorities. As we move this project into the implementation stage, we hope to devise a protocol for adding biographical information about individuals whose names are printed or inscribed in Black books to these large collective databases, thereby knitting the histories of those who have published, circulated, and preserved Black books into collective memory. Lots of questions still hover around this project. This is from an early planning session. And in the interest of time, I'll simply flag a few here. We're currently grappling with questions of quality control, questions of scope and comprehensiveness, of consortium building, and of scale. Is it possible for us to create a consortial structure? And this is our beginning consortial structure. Is it possible to create a consortial structure that would enable us to live up to our name, the Black Bibliography Project? Can we record metadata about Black print, not just nationally, but internationally? We don't yet know answers to these questions, but we are delighted to be considering them, and I look forward to discussing them with you. Thanks.
Thank you. And finally, we will hear from TK Sangwand.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you're tuning in from. I hope everyone is safe and well today. My name is TK Sangwand, and I'm speaking to you from Los Angeles, California, which occupies the unceded land traditionally known as Tovangar. I want to uplift and honor any Indigenous folks in this space today who are the original guardians of these lands, for without their stewardship, it would not be possible to be here. Thank you. So thank you, Rafi, for the introduction earlier, and thank you so much to Mark and Kellee for the invitation to be with y'all here today. I'm a librarian and archivist at UCLA currently, where my responsibilities have centered on facilitating post-custodial archival partnerships with cultural heritage institutions in Cuba. However, COVID-19 has brought this work to a standstill, and we don't know if and when we'll be able to continue due to travel restrictions, the tightening US embargo on Cuba, as well as the budget crises related to the pandemic. So today I'll be focusing less on the specificity of the work we do in Cuba and instead focus more on some of the larger institutional and structural issues that underlie post-custodial archival work in general, particularly in this moment when many libraries and archives are awkwardly grappling with their racist and colonialist legacies. But to start us off, I want to share this quote in acknowledgement of some of the existing tensions between the groups represented here today, humanities scholars and archivists. Both within humanities and archival studies discourses, critiques of the archive as well as archives abound. And these critiques range from the imagined work of archivists as handmaidens to the hegemonic totalitarian force of the archive, to more nuanced critiques of how archival collections are made, to the terminology used to describe them, and the ways in which users are granted access to these collections. While there's value in many of these critiques of archivists' role in shaping the archival record in exclusionary ways, I want to encourage us to view the archivist's role with more nuance and to not conflate the archivist with the archive. I want us to pay closer attention to how the larger institutional structures and leadership of academic libraries and archives shapes the archival record in ways that hold archives' inherited legacies of white supremacy and colonialism. And this has been a recent point of reflection as many institutions, libraries and archives included, scramble to share messages of anti-racist solidarity, which creates a sharp contrast to how many BIPOC memory workers actually experience working within library and archive institutions. So in my talk today, I want to showcase BIPOC archivists' agency in creating more ethical and liberatory archives through a post-custodial archival practice, and also highlight the institutional barriers that undermine these efforts, with the hope that we can hold institutions accountable to their public statements on anti-racism. With that said, I also want to acknowledge the limitations of working within academic institutions to cultivate more liberatory archival practices. And this is an argument that archivist Jarrett Drake has wonderfully elaborated on in his 2016 Liberatory Archives Address. I also share the same pessimism about institutional wokeness that librarian David James Hudson speaks about in his latest essay, The Displays, on anti-racist study and institutional enclosure. As he aptly states, while libraries are quick to speak out against racism, and I would also add colonialism, these institutions cannot, structurally speaking, divest themselves from these legacies, which they say has no place on this library or on this campus, or has no place in this library. However, I also want to recognize that many of us will continue to work in these institutions due to the economic necessities placed upon us under racial capitalism. And perhaps compared to other sectors, we may also find that in this space, that we may find space, even within these deeply flawed institutions, to do work that is meaningful to others and fulfilling to ourselves. And I definitely include myself in that category. So I just want to explicitly name that ambivalence that I'm speaking and also working within. So returning to archives. Historically, archives have been physical spaces that require that archival materials be deposited within them in order to be preserved. There are many archives that archival institutions have not deemed important because they don't uphold a cis white male status quo. There are also many archives by individuals and organizations from historically marginalized groups who do not want to donate their archive to archival institutions because they rightfully don't trust them. Thus, these archives lay just outside the historical record and create significant gaps in our collective memory. With the civil rights movements in the 60s and 70s, users demanded that archives document history from the bottom up, and that energy continues today in newer forms. Through such initiatives as Doc Now, that aim to archive Black activist Twitter in ethical ways, and Mercadu, which aims to archive and provide access to Indigenous archives in culturally relevant ways, and 60 Inches from Center and the Blackavists, who are doing amazing community-based archival work in Chicago. And shout outs to Stacey Williams of the Blackavists, who's also on the conference schedule tomorrow. Within the past decade, I've witnessed the archival field undergo a significant, irreversible shift with a newer generation of archivists, many more who are BIPOC, demanding that archival praxis be oriented in service of justice and that all archives have the responsibility to actively document and preserve the voices and experiences of groups who have been historically underdocumented or excluded from or maligned by the historical record. As part of this newer generation of archivists, my professional philosophy is that archivists should never be gatekeepers of the historical record, and that we must use our expertise in archival preservation with others so that they have agency in preserving their own histories. Over the past decade, I have worked as an archivist within U.S. academic institutions, UCLA and UT Austin, to address gaps in the historical record by facilitating partnerships with human rights organizations and cultural heritage organizations in the Global South to preserve their archival materials and maintain them within their communities of origin. In archival terms, we call this post-custodial partnerships. These collaborations don't require partners to relinquish custody of their physical materials and give them to a large US university for preservation. Rather, we work with partners to build digitization and preservation capacity within their organization so they can utilize their archives in ways that are most meaningful to them. I apologize, I don't know why that image isn't showing up. So typically what this means in practice is that the US university travels to the partner organization, provides digitization equipment, conservation supplies, and training to the partner organization so that they can digitize and preserve their materials on site. In exchange, the US university receives digital copies of the materials for long-term preservation and to provide online access for its faculty, students, and a broader public. And through these partnerships, we've preserved testimonies of survivors of the Rwandan genocide, radio recordings from the Civil War in El Salvador, police records from the Civil War in Guatemala, newspapers that document the daily life of Afro-descendant populations in Nicaragua, radio recordings, newspapers, and posters from pre- and post-revolutionary Cuba, and oral histories from people impacted by capital punishment in Texas. These archives are invaluable to the historical record and likely would have been lost without a post-custodial archival intervention. In all these cases, post-custodial partnerships were not only the ethical choice, but a necessary one. Considering the US's neocolonial and interventionist histories, as in the case in Central America, or non-intervention in the case of Rwanda, it's not difficult to understand why Global South institutions would refuse to hand over their archival histories to a large Global North institution. However, while post-custodial collaborations lend themselves to a more ethical archival engagement, they are also not exempt from ethical challenges that arise from uneven power dynamics within and between institutions. So now I'll talk briefly about some of the challenges that archivists face when building ethical post-custodial partnerships, and then discuss some of the more insidious institutional barriers that undermine these ethical approaches to post-custodial work. So one of the foundational elements of post-custodial partnerships is building trust. Trust is earned by archivists taking the time to travel to partner organizations, listening and understanding their priorities and the socio-political context in which they work, speaking their language, and I mean that literally when going to another country where the language is not English, and making commitments that the US institution can uphold. Some barriers to building trust are trying to force a relationship or speed it up because of grant deadlines, or not having the staff with linguistic skills or cultural competencies to build a substantive relationship. So once this level of trust is established, then partners can work towards building archival capacity for archival preservation and digitization. And typically the US institution will contribute that archival expertise, the conservation supplies, the equipment for digitization and digital access, and the training that is relevant to the partner's local context. These trainings must often be adapted to account for differences in access to electricity, internet, software, hardware, electronic repair services, language, existing skill levels, and numerous other factors. And one major barrier to this work is when US institutions deny funding for necessary supplies and travel that they do not see as yielding a tangible benefit for the US institution. So these are some of the specific challenges that archivists face when trying to build ethical post-custodial partnerships. And now I want to share a few more concrete examples of how these challenges are exacerbated by larger institutional barriers steeped in white supremacy and colonialism. I will also provide some concrete approaches that can mitigate some of the damages that these barriers inflict. So since post-custodial archival partnerships as a collection development strategy are relatively new in institutional archival practice, many of these post-custodial initiatives in academic libraries receive seed funding in the form of grants. Many institutions use the language of developing less colonial, more community-oriented collecting practices in order to position themselves as a desirable recipient of funding for these initiatives. And indeed, many of these institutions may employ memory workers that are dedicated to ethical and liberatory archival work. And often the folks who are doing this work identify as BIPOC and are written into these grants. However, it's not always the case that these memory workers are at the drafting table for these grant proposals and or are entrusted with oversight of the projects once they are funded. This phenomenon of using BIPOC staff to help secure funding, but not empowering them with the management of these projects and or collections, is what archivist Tamar Evangelistia Doherty has coined curatorial blackface. And David James Hudson has theorized this type of tactic as a way for libraries to adapt a racially competent self-image in order to meet specific political economic demands, aka grants. So what are some concrete steps that institutions can take in order to end this practice of curatorial blackface? 1, abolish contingent labor in archives. Too many archives are sustained by archival workers in temporary positions, and BIPOC folks are often represented in term-limited positions as diversity fellows or archivists with specific subject and or language expertise to work with post-custodial collections. Hiring temporary staff for these post-custodial positions does not enable sustainable relationships with partner organizations. And this is damaging to the foundational trust of the collaboration, where when a partner's primary contacts leave, and there's no one to hold the US institution accountable for its commitments. 2, library leadership needs to cede power. When institutions apply for funding for post-custodial projects, BIPOC staff, the ones who are already committed to doing ethical and liberatory archival work, should be at the table collaborating on writing the grant proposal. They should also be named as principal investigator or co-principal investigator. This role should not go to library administrators by default. When BIPOC staff with this demonstrated commitment to ethical archival work have the authority to lead such projects, this will help ensure that projects are actually executed with the cultural competencies and ethical considerations that are necessary for these post-custodial partnerships. Additionally, this experience helps build a leadership pipeline for BIPOC staff who are notoriously underrepresented in management positions across academic libraries. So once these grant funds are awarded to do post-custodial archival collaborations, library leadership should begin planning for how the institution can sustain the projects once the grant funding ends. This planning should not come as an afterthought at the end of the grant. The cost of travel, digitization equipment, and archival supplies are not easily allocated from libraries' collection budgets alone. They really require high-level administrative backing in order to secure the necessary funds from available sources. And so integrating these post-custodial partnerships into institutional budgets also demonstrates to Global South archival partners that they will not be dropped as soon as they are no longer economically viable for the larger institution as a means to secure prestigious grants. And as the well-worn adage goes, budgets are moral documents, and integrating post-custodial projects into the institution's operating budget sends a strong message about the institution's commitment to invest in equitable, community-centered partnerships that are not based in the extractivist tendencies that are characteristic of neo-colonial archival practices. So, as I hope I've given some insight to, there is a newer generation of archivists who are committed to ethical archival practices, and yet there are insidious structural and leadership barriers that undermine this work, despite libraries claiming a commitment to anti-racist action. If you're a memory worker committed to ethical and liberatory archival praxis, I implore you to continue in your path to uplift marginalized voices and histories within archives. You are not alone in this work. If you're a faculty member, I implore you to draw attention to archival gaps and lack of BIPOC leadership on these initiatives. If you can, support post-custodial initiatives by teaching the archival materials in the classroom and using it in your research. This shows library leadership that their investments in these initiatives are valued. You have enormous influence on library administrators as one of our most important constituents. And lastly, if you're a library administrator who supports post-custodial collaborations and truly wants to commit to the anti-racist work outlined in your institutional statement, I implore you to listen with humility and cede power to BIPOC memory workers to lead the way. The historical record literally depends on it. Thank you.
So thank you very much, TK, and also to all three of our distinguished panelists for those wonderful, rich, and thought-provoking presentations. I'll just remind you that you can put your questions in the chat, and as they come up, I can present them to the panelists.
I'm a little bit too lazy to write in the chat, and I figured that I would just unmute and put myself here to start things off, if you don't mind. Thank you so much for such a great panel. This is really putting my own brain on overload and possibly on fire. I was wondering, I have a couple of different questions, but Katharine, I was wondering if I could ask you one, such a fascinating set of questions that you're bringing up toward the end of your presentation about employing the generation of capital in a different way. And I was wondering just about the connection to Nazi art and the possible analogies that could be drawn with Nazi art in situations like this, i.e. that that slavery generated capital is not actually owned by the very people who are selling the collections. And is this something that is being discussed that analogy? And has it gotten any kind of traction?
That's such a great question. And that's the first time I've heard someone made that connection, sort of specifically about the sale of archives. But, and so I guess the answer to your question is it being discussed? I guess not in the circles where I've been talking to people about this. But that's exactly the direction I think that we need to be taking this conversation. Because, yeah, I mean, the case of the Thistlewood archives themselves, you know, it's not the descendant of Thistlewood himself who sold them, but, you know, this is, I think what the presentation made clear is how they're still sort of so deeply implicated. And of course, you know, the 6th Lord Monson, it's the 11th Lord Monson who gets the money, right? So this is, I think this is not right. Yeah, so I think that we can look to other examples. I've also been thinking of, you know, sort of ironically, ways in which nations protect themselves from sort of losing their valuable material. You know, so after an archive is sold, you know, there's sort of an evaluation period. How could you use those for reparatory efforts, sort of in contrast to the way they're often being used sort of as nationalist protective instruments? And so, yeah, what you bring up, I think, is another really sort of important idea for how we could sort of move forward in rethinking the selling of these very problematic archives.
Thank you.
So we have 2 questions for TK, and then a question for Meredith. So TK, I'll give you both to field, and then I'll ask the question to Meredith. So the first question is, what advice do you have, this is from Tanya Calvin, for young BIPOC memory workers who are seeking out MLIS programs to apply to? And the second one is, can you speak a little bit about how to codify agreements with partners and donors to community archives so that they also affirm these values, or can you point to some sample resources? And that's from Justin Williams. And the last thing I'll do is just insert myself in the queue after the 2 questions that are already there for a question of my own.
Great. So hi, Tanya. I would say there are no MLIS programs that are not going to be racist or problematic in some way. I think what's really important for BIPOC memory workers is to find their community. Sometimes it may be within your program or just within the wider field. And I think the group Libraries We Hear has done an amazing job at cultivating a space for BIPOC information workers to come together and yeah, really build a community, because so many of us are in institutions where we feel isolated. I think in terms of choosing the right program for you, I mean, I'm most familiar with UCLA as a graduate of that program and as someone who works very closely with it as a librarian now. And, you know, it's not without its problems, but there's definitely, I think, a lot more space there to be critical of the work that we do in the information field. So I think it's worth looking into, but I know, you know, going to grad school is a huge financial burden, and that's also a big consideration. But if you are, you know, a California resident, then, you know, maybe it's more viable. So those are the ones that that's the one that I'm most familiar with. I actually recommend, you know, if there are ones in your area, just talking to students who are in the program and getting a feel for what their experiences are like. And again, joining the community of We Hear, you can actually reach out and say, hey, does anyone have experience with this program? And people are very generous with sharing that information. In regards to agreements with community archives, I'm curious if this person is within like an academic context, such as like I am, because I know a lot of that can be determined by institutional structures of what they need in order to document agreements. At UCLA, it's pretty rigid in the agreements that we have to use, and it was a struggle to even get things translated in another language, and these documents are already very legalistic and confusing to begin with. When I was at UT Austin, we had the opportunity to develop our own MOUs and essentially deed of gifts to you know, formalize the partnership. And I don't know what that's evolved like over time, but it's definitely worth reaching out to the archivists there in asking, because they continue doing post-custodial work in Latin America, and they could probably give some good examples. I'll also point to the South Asian American Digital Archive, which is a completely post-custodial archive. Michelle Caswell is one of the co-founders. She's a really important scholar in terms of doing critical archival studies. So I would recommend looking up her work in general and looking at SADA specifically for some examples. And Burgess Jules is another person who's done a lot of work around community archives and community archives funding, and might also have some good insight there.
Great. And now I have the pleasure of presenting a question from Abby Kremer. Hi, Abby. This is a question for Meredith. Thank you for the wonderful presentations. I had some questions for Meredith McGill. I'm still a little confused by metadata, and I was wondering if you're willing to talk a little more about how metadata is important in digital archives. I also wanted to know about how or if you were talking about texts outside of books in the digital archive, like poetry and pamphlets.
Great. I'll try to be clearer. Sorry if I zoomed a little bit through my presentation. I should make it clear that we're creating a database of metadata only. We're describing books held in other archives, in rare book archives, by and large. We've been working mostly at the Beinecke and the Schomburg. And if you just think about the ordinary metadata in a library catalog, you only have 3 or 4 metadata terms you can search for: author, title, keyword will bring everything up, but in a very flat way. So again, we're using rare book quality, rare book level descriptive terms for our metadata, looking at some of these things are what we think of as the property of the book as object, like binding style, right, extent statement, publisher, printer, that kind of thing. But we also really do include things like dedications, preface writers, and that sort of thing, because we're really aiming at recreating the network of people that are involved in bringing a book into print. So we're vastly multiplying the kind of data that we record and putting them into these relationships, these triples, so they can be searched. So you could theoretically search for all the stereotyped slave narratives. The one list we've been, instead of this is another thing to say, which is in a longer version of the paper. Codex bibliographies have to start by defining their scope. It's like the first thing you do. But we were able to not define the scope, to think about the data model first. But we've begun to start to think about scope. We can't kick that can down the road forever. So we're beginning to think about small or medium-sized groups of text that make sense together, where having this kind of detailed metadata for all of the texts in the list would leverage scholarship. So for this pilot, we did the 100 and 110 slave narratives in William Andrews' canonical list of narratives of enslaved people. And it's been fascinating what we've been able to find out just by entering the data. So one example is we were sitting in the Schomburg, a group of us entering data on different narratives, and we discovered the same daguerreotype studio in Boston was being used for the engraved portraits of frontispieces. We would have only discovered that now somebody could search for portraits and engravers because we've entered that data in. And another example from that same exercise was we were working with the name authority records for this archive of slave narratives, and discovered that an early publisher of Mary Prince's narrative had gone bankrupt as a printer, been deported to Australia, became well known as a botanist, but no one who knows him as a botanist knows he was an early publisher of abolitionist texts. So, we're hoping to begin to piece things together by entering data in this way and to make it searchable in this way. Trying to think what the other part of the question was. Oh, so again, we would hope eventually to be able to include digital objects in our database, but we haven't. We're really struggling now with a vast question of print and also serials. We've developed a separate data model for serials, and any catalogers out there know what a nightmare serials can be, right? The changing titles, the relation of the title to the issues, but we figured out a way to crack that nut. We're really pleased about it. We enter the serial, the periodical title as the work, and the issue in the place of the edition, and all the separate articles like poetry and fiction that appear in the periodical themselves get entered as works and then linked to the issue. that they're in. So we've found a workaround. We're pretty happy with it. We haven't tested it as richly as we'd like to, but I hope that answers all the couple of parts of that question. Thanks.
Great. So the next question is from Marissa Fuentes, and it is for Katharine and other panelists. And the question is, can you talk a little bit about the paywall of the British archives of the slave trade, for example? How might an argument be made that the colonial authors already commodified these subjects of these records?
I guess I can start, and I think this is another really just extremely important idea. And I think the implication here is that, right, of course, there shouldn't be a paywall, that part of a reparatory project includes, is a discussion of access. And I think that there's an extremely persuasive argument that that absolutely should be applied in the case of the British archives, and frankly, archives in many other different institutions and repositories. And so, yes, I would just say, yes, there can and should be an argument made on those lines.
Great. TK or Meredith, would either of you like to jump in on the British archives?
I don't have something specific to say about the British archives, but just to note that for bibliography, it's really important that other people can check your work. And so we've really, in the beginning stages, are committing to only using works that are in archives that people can access. It's just, we thought about this problem of enhancing the value of your collection, your private collection, by entering it all into the database, right? But we're really working against that. We're going to only work, at least initially, with works that can be checked, that can be consulted, because bibliography really depends on that firsthand access. And it's in person. COVID has disrupted our work, but we're taking advantage of the lull to do more grant writing.
Great. The next question comes from Eric Slaughter. Wonderful talks. The way in which critical scholarship drives the market for collectors and institutions was brought out so well by Professor Gerbner. But Professor McGill's presentation makes me think of those areas where some private collectors, and this may be the case for Black authors, are well in advance of the scholarship, bringing materials together in a meaningful way when institutions don't or won't. Could you please discuss this dynamic?
I don't know if you want to start. I feel like we were just sort of going, well, your last comment almost addressed part of this dynamic. You said that you weren't, you're not using private collections in this, right? Which is another, and the reason was, number one, that you want people to access it, checking work, and number two, was it that you recognized the monetary value that you would bring the private collectors? I wasn't quite.
Yeah, we haven't really thought about, I was fascinated by your talk. I don't usually think about my scholarship adding monetary value. It was really mostly the public availability of these materials. And we have so many, we're just beginning, and there's so many collections to record, and we're really thinking in terms of bounded collections where we could flex the power of linked and open data to create new insights. So some of the ones we're thinking about are the first 2,000 books that Arturo Schomburg bought for the Schomburg Library. Delisa Miner-Harris, who is a librarian at Fisk, told us all about the Fisk 100, which was the 100 books that were recommended for every Fisk student to read. There's also a collection of modernist African-American book jackets at North Carolina. So, we're thinking in terms of, at least to begin with, these bounded collections. And also, pedagogy is such an important part of our project. We need to teach people to do this description. So we're really thinking about how to bring groups of graduate students, faculty, undergrad students into collections to do this work of description, to be trained in the principles of descriptive bibliography. Private collectors, they use the BAL, those for working on white authors, and they have tons of knowledge about Black print. But if that work isn't accessible, it's just not going to be a high priority for us.
Great. And next question comes from Christine Khoury. I hope I'm saying that correctly. To Katharine and TK, could you speak a bit more about the digital surrogate of these archives, value and power when they're held in different institutions, i.e. in the post-custodial model, how can we ask the same questions asked about physical collections with the digital surrogates with regards to colonial relationships and where power is held?
I can start us off. I have two kind of things in my head that I'll share as different examples. So in the case of working with the Genocide Archive of Rwanda, there was a physical archive of videotapes, but it was actually what we call a physical digital object. It was a DV tape. And so I don't feel the second part of your question is necessarily relevant to that format. However, I will say, obviously, where these digital copies live and who is the visible intellectual holder of these digital objects obviously makes a difference. So in the case of Rwanda, it was really important that the Genocide Archive be in the custody of the Genocide Memorial, which was run by genocide survivors. And so to that end, it wasn't important to us as an institution at UT Austin that we had a website with their testimonies and it had our brand over it. And so what we did was actually set up a website and make it look like it was coming out of Rwanda. The domain name was genocidearchiveofrwanda.org.rw. Didn't have UT on it at all in the, in the web address or in the branding. And so that was really important and significant for the organization that we're working with. And an example that's a little bit the opposite of that is the Guatemala National Police Archive. And that is obviously a very much a physical archive. It was, tons of paper that was found in an abandoned building that was then digitized. And so UT Austin did have the digital archive where UT Austin was prominently displayed as the host of those materials. And that actually served an important political purpose in the sense that it showed the Guatemalan government that there was international attention on this archive and it would not behoove them if they tried to do anything to restrict access to the archive. And in that way, I feel like that was one of the most valuable aspects of the digital archive, and going to the physical archive was actually more helpful if you were a researcher because that's where they had the specialists who were familiar with the archive and they had more complex databases that they used in-house to navigate the archive. And so the physical and the digital archive actually serve two different purposes. Obviously the digital archive was used for research, but it really had more of this symbolic power attached to it. And then, I don't know if this example is useful, but UT Austin also had a project, the Primeros Libros project, where it brought together incunabula Mexican incunabula that were held at different institutions within the US and Mexico and made them all available through a digital interface. And so in that way, you could actually ask questions of the materials that you couldn't ask of the physical archives because you would have to travel to different states in Mexico, to different states in the US, and that would be extremely, costly in both time and resources. And so I think, it's a complex question. And I hope these examples kind of like show some of those complexities.
That was a great answer. For my project, I'll just add that right. So it's a little bit different in this case with the Thistlewood papers where they're physically at the Beinecke and Beinecke Library, and then it is also Yale, the Beinecke, that's hosting the digitized versions of them. And yes, I mean you can Yale University is an institution. There are a lot of sort of questions that we could raise about where the Thistlewood papers should be, et cetera. Again, I think it's really complex. It's made like we have high quality digitized versions of them now. The increase in sort of the description of them, although I think someone earlier in the chat had sort of recognized there are some problematic aspects of the description as it comes across on the at least in the announcement of when they've been digitized by Yale. So yeah, I mean, I feel like there's it's a deeply embedded problem where we have sort of tensions between access and colonial power and sort of the history and legacy of, you know, institutions that have accumulated huge amounts of wealth based on, you know, among other things, white supremacy, colonialism, etc. And so I guess I would just say it's so important to have these conversations and to be recognizing the dynamics that are happening all the time as you know, values change, both sort of ethical values and then monetary values, and seeing who's benefiting from them as the sort of the landscape shifts underneath us.
So our next question is from Janice Radway. It's for Meredith. Your move away from the privileged author to processes and practices of circulation and use seems to me to suggest that literary study in the discipline of English might or could change radically in response to this work. Have you thought about that, and could you reflect on the possibilities?
Yeah, I'm pretty excited by the possibilities. I should say that when we first started this project, we worried a little bit about attracting grad students as, you know, co-collaborators and researchers. You say the words descriptive bibliography and people run for the exits, right? It's not the sexiest aspect of literary study. But what's interesting is how quickly the students began to see the transformative potential of these tools, which we really haven't had. All kinds of questions really open up for the first time. And I'll just give one example because it's ready to hand. I was doing a little bit of work on Frances Harper and looking at the Boston publisher of her 1854 pamphlet, and just thought I'd poke around and figure out what else he published. It turns out he publishes William Wells Brown, he publishes William Wells Brown's daughter, and Sojourner Truth, like a huge amount of mid 1850s, now canonical Black lit is published by this newspaper publisher. And the more I found out about him, the more interesting the story became. His name is Yarrington. He was the publisher of Garrison's The Liberator, a newspaper publisher and abolitionist. So you could see that Black authors would go to a newspaper, an abolitionist newspaper publisher who would print their stuff. But his son, he publishes it as Yarrington and Son. His son was a stenographer, what's called a phonographer. And he was Ralph Waldo Emerson's favorite stenographer for his lecture tours. And all of a sudden I saw, you've got Frances Harper and Ralph Waldo Emerson, two figures we don't ever see together, right? And they're linked by one person who's at their lectures and performances. You know, so I really think this kind of approach and the tools it gives you to think about structures of circulation can shuffle our canons up in really unpredictable ways. And when literary critics are given different collocations of texts, magic happens. So I'm pretty excited about it. You know, we have a lot of challenges, but I really think there's just a lot of discovery. Every time we start entering data, we start learning things we didn't know about before.
So I'll finally take the opportunity to ask a question myself. Katharine, I wanted to ask you about kind of the role of financial structures and the state in the story you're telling about capital accumulation. I know from my own work on the Bible Museum that there's a kind of story here about nonprofit law and tax exemption and public-private relationships in kind of fostering the growth of capital over the second half of the 20th century. And I wonder if that's at work in the Thistlewood papers, and more broadly, if it's at work, you know, in the kind of stories around capital accumulation and slavery archives.
Thank you. That's a really great question. Can you clarify a little bit more what you mean by like which financial structures in the state? Because I feel like I could take this in a few different directions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking particularly of, there's a new book by Lila Corwin Berman about the growth of philanthropic complexes. And she writes, I mean, they're really tiny examples, but kind of the double exemption policy for appreciated assets where you get to, you know, claim the full deduction value, but don't have to take the capital gains tax and stuff, like just sort of all sorts of ways in which, you know, the transactions around valuable goods, particularly involving nonprofits, then are kind of shaped by tax policy, you know, in the dullest sense. You know? Yes.
Yeah, I actually love going in this direction because, again, I think that it sort of brings to light a lot of sort of the architecture beneath the way that collections are created and value is created. And I think there are a few things I want to say in response. One is regard sort of where the money came from to buy the Thistlewood papers, right? So that's one thing you can look at, and it came from a huge fund that the Osborne Fund at the Beinecke, which, you know, so this is like a family that donated lots of money, and it's supposed to be for, I think, English British literature, right? And so they've sort of pushed, in this case, you have sort of a family's wealth that's then sort of put into an institution with, you know, the family's name on it. And you see, I had to acknowledge it in my slideshow. And there's absolutely ways in which private collectors, when they, and in this case, this isn't for this family because they're giving money, but if you donate a piece of art or something that's valuable, this is getting back to Professor Warren's talk earlier today. It's then you get it appraised, and then you get a tax write-off for that appraisal. And there are different ways of appraising things. And when you're donating something, you appraise it not at market value, you know, not at what it would sell at auction, which is often much lower, but you get it appraised at the highest value it could possibly be, which then, you know, fuels the sort of the flow of items into collections, and also buttresses the wealth of the people who owns these items. So there's a lot of, you know, like, again, it's so complex. On the one hand, you could argue it's giving it, that is policy that drives some items into collections. On the other hand, it's sort of just doubling down on wealth. And so that's one avenue. I could take this. In terms of the Monson family, you know, I don't know their personal finances, but I really want to know also more about what it meant for them to have the Thistlewood papers on deposit at the Lincolnshire County Archives. You know, were they, because at least, you know, if the Lincolnshire County Archives was doing that for free, you know, they archived and cataloged, there were over 10,000 pages in the Thistlewood manuscripts, which was one of several collections. And the archivists write about the huge amount of labor that they put into cataloging everything. So, you know, what does that mean? So you're treating access for giving this family that's already wealthy more wealth through the accumulation of knowledge about their collections that they bought for, you know, maybe above scrap paper. So I feel like I don't want to go too, you know, ramble on too much in this, but I really think that these are the questions that are going to sort of help us recognize that we are in this market. You know, like we can't escape capitalism, and we need to, if we forget, and I know that coming from the discipline of history, there are, you know, most of us in this discipline totally divorce what we're doing from monetary value and from sort of the systems of capitalism, and that is the detriment of really the sort of the ethical imperative of this legacy, of this inheritance that we have. And so I think we really need to be having these conversations. We need to understand tax law and how the Beinecke and Sotheby's was able to attain an export license for the Thistlewood papers. Things like this that really are defining sort of the architecture upon which we are having our conversations about history.
That's just so terrific. I was thinking that as you talked about tax law, I mean, that shows that there's a public investment in these private goods. And thinking about TK's point about the chronically underfunded, understaffed archivists, the depression of wages is producing, I mean, this is an obvious thing, but producing profit for these private families. So you're right, it's an outrage.
Great, well, thank you all for an absolutely wonderful, incredibly stimulating, rich, thought-provoking panel, which I'll be thinking about for weeks, I imagine. It was really great. And with that, I'll close us off and we'll come back soon.